before the storms, before the silence, before the long night swallowed the stars, there was peace. A fragile peace, yes, but real and warm and bright in ways that are almost impossible to imagine from the perspective of the grim ages that followed. The Age of Strife would one day be remembered as humanity's greatest collapse, a sundering of worlds and a shattering of hope. But long before that night fell, there was an age of light, and it began quietly, not as a blaze of glory, but as a gentle, steady rise of knowledge, unity, and discovery spread across the cradle world of Terra and far beyond its skies. It is said in the calm retellings of the scholars who dream of lost eras that there was once a time when the stars felt close, not close enough to touch, but close enough to trust. Humanity had expanded outward like a slowly unfurling flower, petal by petal, system by system, colony by colony, until the night sky was no longer mystery but home. Ships sailed the warp with ease, guided by navigators whose minds did not yet tremble beneath the weight of demonic storms. Astropaths sent messages across light years with clarity like song. Stable routes were mapped, charted, maintained, and honored. Humanity built a great network of connection, a web of shining pathways that carried ideas, trade, hope, and culture to a million distant worlds. This was the golden age of technology, the age before fear, the age before collapse, the age that the galaxy millennia later would mourn like a memory half remembered in a dream. In this era, the worlds of mankind were as varied as the stars that held them. Some were oceans where entire cities floated endlessly on gentle tides. Some were forests older than Terra's continents, their trees rising like emerald cathedrals beneath skies of shimmering violet. Some were deserts, endlessly warm, where glittering solar cities shone like jewels set in gold. And some were frozen worlds, harsh but beautiful, their people hardy, their spirits fierce, their lights a quiet defiance against the crushing cold. But across all of them, no matter the shape or climate or culture, there was connection, a shared understanding that humanity was one people spread across many lights, and that each world, no matter how distant, was part of a greater whole. On Terra, the seat of humankind, cities rose like monuments to everything humanity believed itself capable of. Skyscrapers pierced the sky with glass that shone like polished starlight. Transit systems flowed effortlessly through networks older than memory. Energy was drawn from sources so advanced that later ages would mistake them for magic. Knowledge was not hoarded, it drifted freely, from scholars to engineers to children who saw the universe as a place of possibility, not fear. There were no tyrants yet, no warlords, no endless battles fought for scraps of power. This was not a perfect age, and perfection is a dream that reality rarely honors. But it was harmonious, balanced, peaceful in ways the later Imperium would look back on with longing they would never admit aloud. Even in golden times, the warp was never truly silent. Beneath the surface of this great age, the first subtle ripples of psychic potential began to spread across humanity. Children were born with minds just a little too open, dreams a little too vivid, thoughts that brushed against distant realities like fingertips grazing water. Scholars studied these individuals not with fear but with wonder. Psychic academies emerged, peaceful and careful, designed to guide young minds toward balance and understanding. A Psyker in the Golden Age was not a weapon, not a threat, not something to hide. They were seen as a new step, a quiet evolution of the human soul, a gift that might one day help humanity reach even further into the mysteries of the universe. But the warp, as ever, gives nothing without cost. These early Psykers were sparks in a dry forest, too small to ignite flames but enough to warm the air, enough to signal that change was coming. For thousands of years, this golden serenity endured. Humanity grew, spread, thrived. Worlds were connected by stable warp routes and ancient gate networks whose creators had long since vanished. Artificial intelligences worked alongside humans as partners, not masters. Robotic constructs built cities with elegance and precision. The galaxy itself seemed to open its arms to humankind. But peace, in the great story of the cosmos, is always temporary. Even in this era, the warp had begun to stir just beyond perception. Not violently, not suddenly, not enough to shatter worlds. Not yet, but enough that navigators sometimes hesitated when their vessels approached the immaterium. Enough that astropaths occasionally woke from dreams they could not explain. Enough that certain patterns in the sea of the warp began to darken, if only a little. These were faint shadows on the edge of vision, ignored by most, understood by none. The storms had not yet come, but the winds were changing. And winds, once they rise, rarely settle quietly. Humanity in this age had no concept of how fragile its prosperity truly was. They had forgotten fear on a civilizational scale, forgotten hunger, forgotten isolation, forgotten what it meant to feel small beneath the night sky. And so when the first signs of instability appeared, few paid attention. Why would they? Their worlds spun in harmony. Their technologies seemed unbreakable. Their roots across the stars felt eternal. Entire generations lived and died without sensing the quiet tension building at the edges of reality. But in the warp, where emotion shapes storms, where thought becomes presence, where possibility becomes danger, something was beginning to stir. Something old, something vast, something that did not share humanity's dream of everlasting peace. As the Golden Age reached its height, the seeds of its downfall were already growing. Human emotion, the hopes, the fears, the joys, the despair of a species spread across the stars, washed into the warp in ever-increasing volumes. And emotion is the food of chaos. What began as ripples would eventually become tides. Tides that would one day swallow civilizations whole. But for now, for this brief moment in the long story of humanity, there was peace. A fragile, brilliant peace that deserved to be remembered even though it could not endure. The Age of Strife was not yet upon them, but it was coming. Slowly, silently, inevitably, like a storm on a distant horizon darkening the edges of a clear, gentle sky. It began so softly that almost no one noticed. A gentle wrongness, a faint stirring, like the first breath of wind before a storm that has not yet taken shape. The warp, that shimmering sea of unreality upon which humanity's greatest achievements depended, shifted, subtly, quietly, dangerously. It was not a storm, not yet, just a tremor, a shiver across the skin of the immaterium, a ripple where there had always been calm. But for those attuned to its tides, navigators, psychers, astropaths, the change was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. For the warp is not like the void. It does not drift cold and indifferent. It does not remain constant. It reacts, it responds, it feels. And now, for the first time in millennia, it felt agitated. At first, the disturbances were small, barely there, distortions that could be dismissed as chance. A cargo ship taking a few hours longer to exit the warp than expected. A navigator reporting a faint haze over a once clear pathway. An astropath halting mid-sentence, frowning as if a distant whisper had brushed across their mind. Nothing catastrophic, nothing violent, nothing alarming, just strange. Strange in the way that makes the hairs on the back of the neck rise without understanding why. These signs came and went, so fleeting that most records from this era barely note them. But in hindsight, they were the first raindrops of a coming storm. The great navigator dynasties, those ancient families whose warp-touch genes allowed them to steer ships through the sea of souls, were the first to voice concern. They gathered in shadowed chambers lit by golden lamps and whispered of routes drifting off their charts. Corridors of safe passage seemed to waver like distant heat haze. Landmarks in the warp, those invisible currents and psychic constellations that only navigators could perceive, felt dimmer, less reliable. A few navigators, particularly the oldest among them, refused to enter the immaterium entirely. They spoke of something stirring, something deep, something old. They could not define it and they could not explain it, but they felt it. The way an animal senses the first tremors of an earthquake long before the ground cracks. Astropaths, too, felt the change. Their minds, so accustomed to the smooth flow of psychic communication between stars, began encountering static. Soft at first, a whisper of resistance, Messages once transmitted with crystalline clarity grew faint around the edges as if the warp itself had become heavier to push through. A few astropaths described losing words, not forgetting them but having them dissolve in mid-transmission like mist caught in wind. Their descriptions were poetic, often vague, difficult to catalog, but the pattern was clear. Something was changing. Over time, these isolated anomalies grew more frequent. Warp routes fluctuated. Transit times varied wildly. Psychic messages arrived incomplete or with strange distortions woven into their structure. Sometimes the distortions were harmless, static, echoes, fragments of other messages bleeding through. Other times they were not harmless at all. Astropaths began reporting visions of eyes opening within storms, of hands reaching from churning darkness, of cities submerged beneath oceans of light. They could not explain these dreams, they could not stop them, and they could not ignore them. For every astropath feels the warp not as a distant abstraction but as a presence, a living sea whose tides press against the shores of the soul. And now the tides were rising. Despite the growing evidence, humanity did not react. How could they? For thousands of years, the warp had been calm, obedient, trustworthy. The occasional fluctuation was simply part of travel. The occasional psychic disturbance was simply a curiosity. Most citizens of the Human Federation barely understood the warp at all. To them, the stars still felt open. The routes still felt safe. The warnings still felt like superstition in an age that believed itself beyond fear. And so they dismissed the signs. Humanity had grown used to its own success, to its golden stability, to the illusion that the universe itself had softened beneath their touch. Few had the wisdom to see the truth hidden within the anomalies, that nothing stays calm forever. Perhaps the clearest sign that something fundamental had changed was the rise in psychic births. At first, it was a statistical curiosity, a slight increase in the number of children born with gifts that bent reality in subtle ways. But soon the numbers climbed from dozens to hundreds to thousands. Entire cities reported clusters of children whose dreams affected machinery, whose emotions made lights flicker, whose laughter carried strange harmonics that unsettled those nearby. Academic institutions were overwhelmed. Psychic instructors found themselves teaching classes 3 times larger than any in previous centuries. And the warp, ever sensitive, responded in kind. For every Psyker born, a spark of the materium touched the immaterium. And sparks, when many, become flames. It began innocently. A frightened child who saw monsters in the shadows of their room and accidentally manifested them. A grieving parent whose sorrow made furniture tremble and glass shatter. A teenager whose moment of rage ignited a street lamp like a torch. These were isolated incidents, small, containable. But as the number of Psykers grew, so did the instability. Sleepwalkers would wander towards silent corners of their homes and speak in languages no one had ever heard. Groups of untrained Psykers dreaming in proximity sometimes caused localized warp distortions, tiny flickering rifts that closed as quickly as they formed. Sometimes they did not close quickly enough. A few scientists, a handful of scholars, and even some navigator houses pleaded for caution. They urged for investigation, preparation, restraint. But their words were lost in a sea of human confidence. Humanity had conquered the stars. What was a little turbulence? Humanity had mastered technology. What was a few anomalies? Humanity believed in its own permanence, and permanence breeds blindness. Had humanity listened to these early warnings, perhaps the Age of Strife might have come more gently, more slowly, less violently. But no age ends because a few voices are raised in quiet concern. It ends when the tide becomes too powerful to resist. And the tide was rising, unseen, unheard, unstoppable. The warp was waking, and soon it would no longer whisper, it would roar. The first subtle tremors in the warp had been easy to ignore, but the second wave of disturbances, the first true storms, could not be overlooked forever. They did not arrive with lightning and thunder like tempests in the skies of mortal worlds. Warp storms do not roar. Warp storms do not howl. Warp storms do not break ships with winds or waves. They distort, they fracture, they twist, they unweave. and they began not as cataclysms but as quiet inconveniences, delays, detours, unexpected reroutes that starship captains shrugged off at first. Only later would humanity understand that these early storms were warnings, the last gentle ones they would ever know. The earliest storms were patchwork events appearing in isolated pockets across the galaxy. A safe warp corridor used for centuries would suddenly tilt, drifting out of alignment. Navigators would blink in confusion as symbols in the immaterium twisted subtly into unfamiliar shapes. Ships could still pass, but they moved slower, trusting instincts over engraved maps. Captains reported thick currents, psychic haze, or pressure on the soul. Descriptions varied. None made sense, but all were true. The warp was beginning to turn against them. Not out of malice, not yet, but because it was changing, reacting to a galaxy growing too full of psychic noise. The navigator houses met repeatedly in their ancient sanctums. Their eldest members, those whose warp sight was strongest, grew troubled. They spoke of currents bending inward, of psychoactive waves shaking old roots, of shadows where none had existed before. But they could not prove anything. Charts showed only faint variations. Transit times fluctuated but remained acceptable, so galactic authorities did not intervene, and the warp storms grew bolder. Astropaths began to experience a new kind of interference. Not static, not fragmented echoes, but something like resonance. A low, humming pressure beneath their thoughts whenever they reached into the immaterium. It was not painful, just unsettling. Some described it as being watched. Others felt as though something enormous was shifting deep beneath the surface, too far to see but close enough to sense. Words faded from messages, names blurred, entire paragraphs dissolved into warped imagery only half related to the intended messages. But still, humanity pressed onward. The machine of civilization did not pause for the concerns of its most sensitive minds. Then the disappearances began. A merchant vessel traveling between two well-charted worlds vanished without trace. A transport carrying colonists failed to arrive after a routine jump that should have taken hours. A science vessel sent to investigate reported strange psychic turbulence, then fell silent after a fragmented final message. "We're drifting. This route is wrong. Something is pulling. Light everywhere. We can't..." And nothing more. Such events were rare, but they were undeniable. Warp storms were no longer theoretical. They were real. They were growing. And they were hungry. As reports accumulated, governments grew uneasy. Meetings were held. Experts debated. Some insisted it was a temporary fluctuation, a cosmic event that would settle naturally. Others whispered that something deeper was unraveling, something woven into the fabric of the galaxy itself. But the real problem was distance. Humanity was spread across 1,000,000 worlds, each separated by light years of vacuum and, more importantly, tides of the immaterium. A crisis in one system could not easily be addressed by leaders in another, and the warp seemed intent on testing the limits of human unity. In the years that followed, the storms intensified. They formed faster, lasted longer, and stretched wider. Warp routes that had been stable for centuries flickered in and out of navigability. Some storms lasted mere hours, others lingered for weeks. A few persisted for months, large enough to swallow entire sectors, isolating dozens of worlds in a single sweep. And yet, even then, humanity refused to recognize the truth. The idea that the warp itself was turning volatile felt impossible, unacceptable. They had built an empire on the assumption that the immaterium was tameable, predictable, understandable. To admit otherwise was to admit that their whole foundation was flawed, and so they denied it. As storms grew more intense, communication blackouts became more common. A world might go a week without receiving messages from its neighbors, then a month, then several. Some recovered, others did not. Worlds began to drift apart, not in space but in time and trust. Little by little, the great tapestry of human unity began to fray, not in a single tear, but in a slow, silent unraveling that went unnoticed until it was too late. As humanity expanded, so too did its emotional presence within the warp. Every fear, every ambition, every joy, every sorrow from billions upon billions of lives flowed into the immaterium. For millennia, this energy had been manageable, a gentle tide, a steady rhythm. But now the exponential growth of humanity's psychic imprint began to overwhelm. The sea of the warp like a sudden flood. The warp does not forget. The warp does not forgive. The warp does not ignore the storms born within mortal hearts. It magnifies them, echoes them, feeds on them, returns them in forms mortals cannot control. And now those echoes were growing too loud to contain. There would come a day, a bright, peaceful, unremarkable day, that would be remembered as the last before the true storms began. A day when ships still traveled, a day when messages still arrived, a day when people still believed the galaxy belonged to them. No one would know that the warp on that day was gathering itself, as if inhaling before a scream that would shatter humanity for thousands of years. The Age of Strife had not yet begun, but its winds were rising, quietly, slowly, inevitably, and soon the storms would break in full. Even as warp storms flickered and grew like distant lightning behind a veil of clouds, humanity tried to preserve its fragile sense of normalcy. Ships still moved, though less confidently. Messages still passed, though less clearly. Worlds still traded, though with rising caution. But the greatest and most delicate thread in humanity's vast tapestry began to fray in a far more intimate place, the mind. For as the warp stirred, so did the Psykers. The early Psykers, those born during the calm years of the Golden Age, were few, their powers faint and manageable. They studied in peaceful academies dedicated to understanding the gift of psychic connection. These sanctuaries were quiet places, gardens, libraries, stone halls built with serenity in mind. Students practiced meditation, learning to touch the warp with gentle, careful fingers. Psykers were not feared then. They were seen as pioneers of a new horizon of human potential. But the next generation, the children born as the warp began to ripple, did not have gentle talents. They did not have soft dreams. They did not grow in serenity. They grew in turbulence. Psychic academies found themselves facing students whose powers manifested earlier, louder, more violently than ever before. A child might cry and cause lights to flicker. A child might laugh and make objects shift as if caught in a sudden breeze. A child might dream and unknowingly open tiny cracks into the warp. Cracks small enough to close quickly but large enough to let something look through. At first, the instructors believed they could adapt. More meditation, stricter training, additional supervision. But the storm inside the warp was growing faster than human discipline could keep pace with. One by one, the sanctuaries began to experience incidents that could not be explained by normal psychic fluctuation. A young student meditating before dawn might suddenly scream as if touched by something unseen. A classroom might fill with a scent of burning metal and cold wind, though no window was open. A group dreaming in unison might create a shared hallucination so powerful that instructors watching over them would see it too. These incidents were frightening, but still survivable. Still containable, but the breaches grew bolder. The first documented breach that caused true devastation occurred on a quiet world in a sanctuary built on a hillside overlooking a silver lake. A teenage Psyker, XVIII, brilliant, fragile, deeply attuned, that fell into a dream, so vivid that it began shaping reality around him. He dreamed of a creature with too many eyes, too many hands, too many mouths, whispering in voices no one had ever heard. And the creature answered, not fully, not physically, but partially, just enough to reach through the thin membrane between dream and truth. It touched the boy's mind, and the sanctuary burned. The boy survived only because the creature retreated as suddenly as it arrived, pulled back into the warp by some unknowable current. But the damage was done. Dozens dead, hundreds wounded. A place of peace turned to ash. Psyker incidents began accelerating. At first one a year, then several a month, then dozens across the galaxy every single day. Reports were eerily consistent. Dreams leaking into reality, objects moving without cause, voices speaking in languages no human had ever known, shadows twisting into unnatural forms. cold spots appearing in warm rooms, all symptoms of warp bleed, the thinness between worlds growing thinner still. Families began hiding psychic children. Governments issued containment orders. Whispers spread that Psykers were cursed, born wrong, tainted. Fear grew, and the warp, sensitive, responsive, fed on that fear and grew stronger still. As incidents increased, psychic academies changed. Meditation halls were reinforced with anti-warp technology. Dormitories were sealed with psychic dampeners. Instructors wore protective amulets crafted to stabilize the minds of those they taught. The sanctuaries became locked compounds, not places of learning, but places of containment. Psykers were no longer students, they were wards, patients, in some cases prisoners. Then came the incidents that no amount of technology could prevent. True possessions, where a mind became a doorway, where a psyche became a beacon, where a soul became a battlefield between a human will and a whispering voice that promised things no mortal being should ever hear. These events were rare, but when they occurred, they were catastrophic. A single possessed Psyker could unleash horrors that entire security forces struggled to contain. Sometimes the Psyker survived, most times they did not. And each possession served as a grim reminder of the growing truth. The warp was no longer a calm passageway. It was waking. It was watching. It was hungry. One by one, the sanctuaries fell. Some were overrun by demonic incursions. Some tore themselves apart from overwhelming psychic discharge. Some simply stopped communicating, their halls silent save for burned-out lights and shattered stone. A few were abandoned before disaster struck, their staff evacuating as soon as they realized the truth. They could no longer protect their students, and they could no longer protect the galaxy from what their students might become. Leaders of the remaining academies sent desperate appeals to the Human Federation. We need support. We need containment. We need research. We need help. But the warp storms had already begun to disrupt communications on a scale far greater than anyone had anticipated. Their pleas echoed into silence, lost in transit, or distorted, or intercepted by things that were not human. No help came, no reinforcements arrived, no cures were found, and no solutions emerged. Only fear and chaos and silence. The final Psyker Academy to remain operational was built within a mountain complex on a distant, peaceful world. It had weathered small storms, minor breaches, fleeting shadows, but it could not survive what was coming. When the warp storm above the planet finally broke open, the mountain itself trembled. The sky darkened, not with clouds, but with shimmering distortions like tears in fabric. Every Psyker inside felt a sudden, overwhelming presence, vast, cold, and curious. And then, not long after, the sanctuary went silent. No survivors, no signals, nothing left but scorched stone and the faint scent of ozone and ash. The fall of the Psyker sanctuaries marked the true beginning of humanity's descent. Without trained Psykers, the galaxy lost its most valuable guides into the warp. Without guidance, travel became dangerous. Without travel, worlds became isolated. Without connection, fear took root. And fear, more than any warp storm, is what feeds chaos the most. The Age of Strife did not begin with a single catastrophe. It began with 1,000 small fractures in the minds of humanity, each one widening as the warp pressed in. Soon those fractures would split entire worlds, and the storm would truly begin. There comes a moment in every great collapse, when cracks stop being cracks and begin to look like fractures, when small failures start linking together into something larger, something undeniable, something fatal. For humanity's vast interstellar federation, that moment came quietly. No grand explosion, no dramatic broadcast, no declaration of doom, just silence. First brief, then lingering, then absolute. The failure of Psyker sanctuaries had weakened the foundation, but the warp storms finished the job. And the old Federation, so proud, so vast, so certain of its strength, began to collapse like an ancient monument whose pillars had been eaten away by countless unseen currents. The first systems to lose communication were the ones farthest from Terra, the rimward worlds, the distant colonies. The outposts built 3 or 4 generations earlier. At first, governors assumed it was a technical issue, a malfunction, a damaged relay. Something expected, something routine. They sent ships to investigate it. The ships did not return. Navigators attempting to reach the affected regions reported psychic interference so dense it felt like trying to walk through boiling water. Warp currents bucked, twisted, and inverted themselves like living beasts. Entire routes blinked out of existence. Others shifted position as though trying to evade detection. And worlds that had once been a short jump away became unreachable in a single night. The next warning signs arrived not as screams or pleas or frantic messages, but as fragments, a half-sentence, a blurred symbol, a corrupted image of a city skyline flickering as if submerged underwater. One message, transmitted from a colony on the edge of a growing warp storm, was preserved in a damaged relay core. It read, "Behind the light, we cannot. They're singing. Do not come. The sky is..." Then nothing. Just static. Then a sound no human voice had ever made, a sound that would later be recognized as warp resonance, as a storm's howl, as a warning no one knew how to interpret. As isolation spread, regional governments scrambled to maintain order. But how do you govern when you cannot speak to half your territories? How do you coordinate defense when no information arrives intact? How do you reassure populations when your own leaders receive only silence from the worlds they command? Confusion bloomed, then uncertainty, then fear. Local leaders issued contradictory directives. Starships patrolled blind. Councils dissolved into arguments that solved nothing. Entire sectors behaved as though they had become independent nations overnight. Not by rebellion, but by accident. The galaxy was unraveling, and no one stood at its center to hold it together. The bureaucratic backbone of the Federation, the vast sprawling web of officials, archivists, data architects, and planetary coordinators, faltered under the strain. Record keepers lost access to entire planetary logs. Supply routes were marked temporarily closed, then indefinitely delayed, then presumed inaccessible. Shipments of food and medical supplies never arrived. Requests for aid were queued in systems so overloaded that responses, when they came at all, arrived months after they were needed. Some regions waited, others improvised, others collapsed into chaos within weeks. Without warp travel, an interstellar economy cannot survive. Factories shut down as raw materials stopped arriving. Colonies starved as agricultural shipments failed to pass through the storms. Trade hubs became ghost towns, vast orbital stations drifting in silence as their traffic dropped from thousands of ships per day to almost none. Markets froze, currencies failed, local rulers hoarded resources. A few worlds thrived temporarily because they were self-sufficient, but most had grown reliant on the interconnected web that once bound humanity together. And when the web broke, they fell with it. As panic spread, governments turned inwards. They issued decrees banning travel without strict authorization. They cut communications to control misinformation. They established curfews, checkpoints, military patrols, emergency rationing. Psykers, once valued scholars, were rounded up for their own safety. Some were taken to secure facilities. Some vanished in the confusion. Some were killed by frightened mobs. Fear had become the dominant force in human affairs. And the warp, ever reactive, fed greedily on that fear. Within a single century, a blink on the scale of human history, the Federation became a galaxy of isolated islands. Worlds that had once welcomed travelers became suspicious of all outsiders. Planets traded only with their moons. Moons traded only with their orbital stations. Entire star systems forgot the names of their neighbors. Some cultures regressed to feudalism. Others turned to warlords. Others built new belief systems centered around the storms that tore their skies. Humanity was dividing, fracturing into countless shapes with no way to remember that they had once been one. Conflicts that would once have been mediated by interstellar councils now spun wildly out of control. A dispute over water rights on a frontier world escalated into a planet-wide war. A neighboring system, misreading the chaos as aggression, launched preemptive strikes. 2 more systems joined out of fear. By the time the warp storms cleared enough for messages to pass, 3 planets had been sterilized by orbital bombardment, not because of ideology or rebellion or conquest, but because of miscommunication and panic. Such tragedies became increasingly common as the galaxy's bridges fell into dust. For a long time, Terra believed that it was safe. The center, the heart, the oldest and most stable of humanity's worlds. But isolation does not discriminate. Even Terra began to lose contact with key regions of its empire. First with distant colonies, then with mid-range worlds, then with systems barely a few jumps away. The high authorities tried desperately to maintain control. They issued continent-wide announcements urging calm. They promised solutions, investigations, stability. But their own requests for information returned incomplete, or not at all. The old Earth felt smaller with each passing year as the galaxy beyond drifted into silence. There came a point, quiet, unmarked, without ceremony, when humanity as a whole realized the truth. They were alone. Not spiritually, not emotionally, not philosophically, but literally. Cut off from the millions of worlds that had once formed their interstellar civilization. Entire sectors silent, entire routes dead, entire histories lost. The old Federation did not fall in a single day, or a single battle, or a single decision. It fell slowly, softly, in the accumulating weight of 1,000 small failures. The Golden Age had ended, and in its place stood a long night filled with doubt, fear, and isolation. A night that would last for thousands of years. A night known forever as the Age of Strife. For as long as anyone could remember, there had been shortcuts through the dark. Not every journey between stars required diving fully into the shifting, shimmering ocean of the warp. There were places ancient and enigmatic where humanity had learned to bend distance quietly, to step from one point in the galaxy to another without surrendering entirely to the immaterium storms. They were not common. They were not simple, but they existed. They were the stellar gates, and for many worlds, they were the difference between isolation and belonging. No one in the crumbling days before the Age of Strife could say with certainty who had built the gates first. Some claimed they were relics of humanity's own forgotten genius from the darkest depths of the golden age of technology. Others whispered that they were inherited, repurposed from older, vanished civilizations who had crossed the stars before mankind ever left Terra. The truth was buried beneath layers of lost data, forgotten archives, and the arrogance of a species that believed the how no longer mattered as long as the gates worked. And in those days, they did work. They hung in space like great silent crowns, vast rings of metal and crystal, anchored by gravitic pylons, surrounded by fields of light that shimmered softly as ships approached. You did not simply jump through a stellar gate. You aligned. You waited. You listened to machine voices that sang in tones too pure to be accidental. Then, at the right moment, a corridor of reality would loosen, not torn, not shattered, just gently folded, and a vessel that should have taken weeks or months to cross the gulf would instead pass through in moments. Efficient, elegant, almost serene. For many, the gates were less frightening than the yawning madness of deep warp travel. They felt safer, cleaner, civilized, until the day they began to die. The early signs of failure were subtle. A gate that took longer than usual to cycle its transit sequence. A transient fluctuation in the containment fields. A slight misalignment in arrival coordinates. Not dangerous, but worrying. Technicians adjusted parameters, calibrated sensors, checked software and hardware and the inscrutable, almost sacred cores at the heart of each ring. They found nothing wrong that made immediate sense. The gates were working, just less smoothly, like a singer whose voice had begun to crack on notes they once held effortlessly. Reports accumulated, warnings were filed. But the galaxy was vast, and no central mind was tracking every tremor in every gate across 1,000,000 worlds. Patterns formed in the spaces between where no one was looking. The stellar gates, for all their elegance, were not separate from the warp. They touched it. They shaped it. They leaned carefully against its currents, using mathematics and machinery to coax it into cooperating. They did not open true raw portals like those torn by demons. They opened narrow, stabilized corridors, artificial eddies in a storm-tossed sea. But when the sea itself began to churn far more violently than their creators had ever accounted for, the equations faltered. The calibrations drifted. The gates, so dependable, so precise, XVIII, began to suffer from one simple fatal problem. They had been built for a calmer warp than the one that now rose around them. The earliest disasters were written off as isolated tragedies. On one world, a gate flared too brightly upon activation, its inner ring twisting with a scream of stressed metal. The transport ship caught in its throat simply vanished. Sensors recorded a brief spike of impossible readings as if the ship had been stretched thin as a thread and scattered across dimensions no human physics had ever named. On another station, a gate locked open for 30 seconds too long. What emerged was not a ship, but a howl. Not a sound in any classical sense, but a psychic pressure. That made every mind nearby reel in terror. Lights burst. Glass shattered. Technicians clawed at their own faces to escape visions that were not theirs. And then, in a single blink, the gate went dark. Its ring froze. Its core collapsed. Its inner field fell silent. The station drifted afterward, intact, functioning, utterly empty. Faced with mounting failures, engineers and scholars across the Federation threw themselves into the problem. They tried rebuilding the field harmonics, reinforcing stabilizers, creating new predictive models that could account for warp volatility. Some succeeded in restoring partial function for a time. Others made things worse. In some systems, the decision was made to shut down the gates proactively until conditions stabilized. Those gates never opened again. In other systems, local authorities refused to cut themselves off. They kept their gates active until the machinery tore itself apart under stresses it had never been designed to bear. Those systems lost not only their gates, but often the stations, ships, and people nearby as well. If one could step back, far enough to see the map of human space laid out as a web of light, the death of the stellar gates would have looked like candles being snuffed out in slow motion. One ring here, another there, a cluster along a busy trade lane, a hub serving an entire subsector. Each went dark for reasons that differed in their details but were identical in their cause. The warp no longer tolerated such neat, clean pathways cut through its heart. Humanity had grown too numerous, too loud, too emotionally volatile. The immaterium had swollen with their dreams and fears to the point that its storms could no longer be neatly threaded aside. The gates had saved humanity time, effort, and risk for thousands of years. Now they became liabilities. And one by one they failed. For some planets, the loss of their gate was an inconvenience. They still retained warp-capable fleets, experienced navigators, and alternative routes backed by centuries of charted experience. They struggled, but they adapted. For other worlds, the gate had been their only artery to the rest of human space. They had no fleets, no navigators, no backup infrastructure. They had believed the gate would always open. When it did not, they were alone in an instant. A mining world that exported rare elements in exchange for food found its stockpiles suddenly worthless. An agri-world that fed 10 nearby colonies watched its surplus rot in fields and silos, unable to ship it away. A research world home to thousands of scientists and only minimal industry ran out of critical supplies within months. Entire economies collapsed overnight for reasons no farmer, no miner, no dock worker could begin to understand. All they knew was that the sky no longer opened when it was supposed to. In the ruins of failed infrastructure, belief began to reassemble itself in new shapes. On some worlds, desperate people gathered around dead gates and built shrines from scrap metal and stone. They lit candles at the base of towering rings. They sang hymns to the silent machinery. They tossed offerings into the inactive cores. Food, trinkets, sometimes animals, sometimes more. They called them doors of heaven, crowns of the ancients, the throats of the sky, for they remembered that once stepping into these places had meant stepping into the wider galaxy. Now, standing beneath their shadow felt like standing before a god that had turned its face away. Some cults prayed for the gates to open again. Others warned that if they did, only monsters would emerge. Eventually, the number of functioning gates fell so low that their remaining activity barely registered on the scale of galactic transit. Most networks had collapsed. Most hubs were useless. Most knowledge of their deeper workings had been lost in the chaos. Records of the last gate's failure are fragmentary at best. Some say it shut down peacefully, its core simply cooling after one final uneventful transit. Others claim it tore itself apart in a storm of light and warp fire, taking an entire fleet and the station around it into oblivion. However it happened, one truth remains. There came a day when no stellar gate opened anywhere for anyone. From that moment on, humanity's only passage between the stars was through the raw warp itself. A sea now so violent that many ships no longer dared to sail it. The shortcuts were gone. The bridges were broken. The galaxy had grown much larger and much lonelier in a single unmarked moment. With the death of the gates, the last illusion of interstellar cohesion collapsed. Carefully balanced trade systems fell apart. Federated regions fractured into rival blocks. Some planets turned their gaze inward, trying to survive with what they had. Others turned outward in anger, suspicion, or hunger, seeking to seize from neighbors what the gates had once allowed them to receive peacefully. And above it all, invisible to most, the warp continued to churn. The gods of chaos, born from emotion, fed by fear, watched with a kind of dark fascination as the species that had once danced freely between the stars stumbled into isolation. The Age of Strife was no longer coming. It was here, deep, cold, unforgiving, and yet somewhere beneath polluted skies and warring tribes. On a wounded Terra, a silent figure was watching it all unfold with golden, patient eyes. The gates had died, the bridges had burned, but the story of humanity was not finished. Not yet. When the stellar gates went dark and the warp storms grew thick and wild, humanity became a constellation of lonely lights. Not a unified civilization, not a galactic people, not the vast interconnected web that had once stretched from Terra's cradle to the rimward edge of the void, but islands, drifting in a cosmic ocean that no longer welcomed travel. Islands with fading memories of the age when the stars were close enough to touch. The collapse of the Federation had been dramatic, public, violent, chaotic, but isolation was quieter. It came like dusk, slow, inevitable, soft around the edges. One day a world had trade, the next day it did not. 1 month a world received messages, the next month it heard only static. 1 year a world had allies, the next year it had only itself. Some planets were prepared for isolation. Agri-worlds had food, forge worlds had factories, research worlds had knowledge, industrial hubs had infrastructure. But many worlds had been built upon the assumption that connection was eternal. Colonies designed to import all their necessities. Mining stations that shipped raw ore in exchange for rations, medicine, and technology. Frontier settlements with barely enough population to sustain themselves without outside support. When isolation hit, it hit them first, it hit them hardest, and it hit them without warning. One moment the sky shimmered with arriving transports, the next just silence. At first people waited. They watched the skies for familiar lights. They listened for the hum of engines. They opened comm channels every morning, hoping someone, anyone, would speak from the void. Days passed, weeks, months. Winter came on some worlds, drought on others, civil unrest on many. Still they waited. Still they hoped. But hope, when stretched too thin, becomes something brittle, something sharp, something dangerous. As years turned into decades and decades into centuries, the shaping forces of isolation began to sculpt humanity into strange new forms. Some worlds clung desperately to the old ways. They preserved archives, recited histories, taught children about Terra as though it were a mythic place from ancient legend. On these worlds, the dream of reunification never truly died. Others drifted into entirely new identities. Languages diverged. Customs mutated. Old technologies were preserved by ritual rather than understanding. A grav generator became a sacred relic. A plasma cutter became a hereditary weapon. A data archive became an oracle consulted by tribal leaders for its flickering visions. Warp storms made communication impossible. Isolation made reinvention inevitable. When central authority fades, new authority fills the void. Planetary governors became kings. Kings became emperors. Factory foremen became warlords. Security chiefs became tyrants. Some ruled wisely, guiding their people through hardship with discipline and compassion. Most did not. The Age of Strife was not known for gentle leadership. It was known for desperation, for scarcity, for the slow, grinding violence born from fear and dwindling resources. Across millions of worlds, strange new societies emerged. On water worlds, floating cities broke apart into nomadic fleets moving endlessly across storm-churned seas. On death worlds, harsh conditions forced humanity to become fiercer, more efficient, more tribal, to survive. On fortress moons, ancient weapons once used for defense were turned inward as rival clans fought over dwindling supplies. On forge worlds, the priesthoods that maintained technology rose in power, speaking of circuits, and engines like they were divine. On far frontier planets, entire communities forgot the existence of the wider galaxy altogether, their myths shrinking to encompass only their own skies. Isolation not only separated worlds, it carved them into countless new civilizations that no longer recognized each other as kin. Technology, so abundant and effortless in the Golden Age, eroded under the weight of neglect. Without trade, spare parts ran out. Without engineers, maintenance faltered. Without instruction, complex machines became inscrutable mysteries. Humanity did not forget everything, but it forgot enough. Forgot how to cure once manageable illnesses, forgot how to operate once common devices, and forgot how to read certain data formats, forgot the difference between myth and recorded history. On some worlds, the past remained intact only in fragments. Shards of truth hidden inside legend. Stories of the old light, of the sky roads, of the lords who came from the stars. Tales once factual becoming myth by sheer passage of time. Terra itself became a rumor on distant worlds. Some remembered it as the home of humanity. Others believed it a divine realm lost in the heavens. Others doubted it had ever existed. Without the ability to travel freely, the idea of Earth became as mythical as ancient Atlantis or Eden. A place spoken of with reverence, longing, or skepticism, depending on the world. Some planets still held old records of Terra's coordinates, but navigation charts without stable warp routes were like maps written on water. As humanity fractured, its psychic potential continued to grow. More Psykers emerged each generation. More minds touched the warp without guidance, without training, without safety. On isolated worlds, a single untrained Psyker could devastate entire settlements by accident. A nightmare, a surge of emotion, a moment of loss translating into tangible catastrophe. Some communities treated Psykers as sacred, others as cursed, most as dangerous. In the absence of the old academies, fear dictated policy, and fear as always fed the warp. And the warp, as always, fed chaos. On many worlds, the collapse of infrastructure and the loss of interstellar support spawned a strange hybrid culture. Barbaric, yet technological, tribes clad in furs fought with chain blades and energy weapons. Warlords rode to battle in armored wagons pulled by engines they did not understand. Massive reactors powered crude fortresses decorated with bones, scrap metal, and flickering hollows whose faces no longer meant anything to those who watched them. It was a kind of regression that was neither primitive nor advanced, but something uncanny in between. A reminder that humanity's rise had never erased its older instincts. Over centuries, isolation reshaped not only cultures and technologies, but minds. A species once unified by shared purpose and communication became fractured in spirit as well. Each world crafted its own identity, its own truths, its own histories, its own fears. And without the stars to remind them of their place in a greater whole, humanity forgot that it had ever been one people, forgot how it had once lived among the stars with reverence and wonder, forgot how it had once stood on the edge of possibility and believed the universe welcomed them. Now the universe felt colder, darker, silent. And on each isolated world, the night sky, looked like a prison rather than a promise. With the loss of travel, the loss of trade, the rise of warlords, and the fading of ancient knowledge, the Age of Strife fully enveloped the galaxy. Some worlds endured with dignity. Some survived through brutality, some fell into ruin. Millions died, billions endured, trillions forgot the galaxy their ancestors had once known. And through it all, the warp storms raged on, violent and unceasing like the heartbeat of a universe remembering its rage. Isolation had reshaped humanity, but it had not destroyed it. Not yet. Somewhere in the ruins of Terra, a presence waited. Ancient, patient, and far stronger than any warp storm. The age of darkness was deepening, but a new dawn was beginning to stir. As isolation tightened its grip around 1,000,000 human worlds, a new pattern emerged. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady. Like iron rusting across the spine of civilization. Where unity once held, fracture took root. Where shared governance once guided, authority vanished. Where hope once connected worlds, fear now divided them. And into that fear, as always happens when the lights of order go dim, stepped those who sought power. Some out of necessity, some out of desperation, some out of cruelty born from the long shadow of the Age of Strife. These were the Warlords, the Tyrants, the self-proclaimed rulers of fractured worlds who claimed dominion over whatever they could seize, by promise, by manipulation, or by blood. When the federated systems collapsed, their appointed governors lost contact not only with Terra but with the neighboring systems that once supported them. Without oversight, governments fragmented, planetary councils dissolved into competing factions. Administrators became rivals. Rivals became enemies. The machinery of order did not break in a single blow. It decayed, bolt by bolt, office by office, law by law, until nothing remained but scattered pockets of authority too weak to command obedience beyond the walls of their own compounds. And so humanity learned a timeless truth: nature abhors a vacuum. But people fear one, and in that fear they accept new masters. The earliest tyrants were not ambitious conquerors, they were survivors. A militia captain with a well-armed regiment and a warehouse full of supplies. A mining magnate whose private security force was the only remaining authority after planetary communications failed. A charismatic prophet who interpreted the warp storms as divine punishment and claimed the right to guide the people through the end times. They stepped into the void because no one else could, or because no one else dared. But once in power, they did not give it up. For power in the Age of Strife was the only shield against the chaos that gnawed at the edges of every world. On many worlds, the warlords did not rule from stone keeps or wooden halls. They ruled from crumbling skyscrapers lit by flickering generators, from bunkers woven with rusted circuitry, from fortress cities built on the skeletons of fallen megastructures. Their armies were not primitive hordes, but bands of fighters wearing scrap plate armor over void suits, wielding slug throwers alongside laser pistols, carrying chain blades powered by batteries they could barely repair. A strange mix of barbarism and forgotten technology, a hybrid culture born of desperation and limited understanding. It was possible to see a warrior bearing a spear charged with crackling energy in one hand and a rusted machete in the other. Possible to see a tribal chieftain kneeling before a damaged terminal that flickered with the face of a long-dead administrator, whom they now believed to be a spirit that guided their clan. In the Age of Strife, myth and machine danced together in uneasy union. As resources dwindled and populations grew desperate, city-states rearmed their ancient weapons. Orbital defense cannons came alive once more. Autogun turrets were reprogrammed to fire on any stranger. Barricades that had not been used in 1,000 years were erected with feverish urgency. Mercy became a luxury no leader could afford. Refugees were turned away from city walls by soldiers who once would have welcomed them. Starving families became threats. Desperate crowds became mobs. Mobs became armies. And armies, in the absence of law, became instruments of whichever tyrant rose quickest to seize control. On industrial worlds and forge planets, the fall of the Central Federation gave birth to a new kind of warlord, the techno-chieftain. These were individuals who commanded not just soldiers but knowledge, or what counted as knowledge in the Shattered Age. A clan that possessed a functioning reactor core was a kingdom. A tribe that preserved a cache of ancient weapons became an empire. A stronghold with a working manufactorum could dominate an entire hemisphere. Over time, these clans developed ritualistic relationships with their machines. To repair a plasma generator was a sacred act. To awaken an old tank was a ceremony. To activate a dormant mech frame was a moment of holy significance. Their leaders wore cables like finery and adorned their armor with broken cogwheels and glowing data sigils whose meanings were long misunderstood. And their warriors marched to battle with chants that were once maintenance codes. Not all rulers were forged from steel and desperation. Some were forged from minds that burned too brightly. As warp storms intensified, untrained Psykers continued to emerge, more numerous and more powerful than ever before. On isolated worlds, a single Psyker could become a figure of terror or reverence. Some ruled through fear, their powers so volatile that no one dared oppose them. Others ruled through awe, their visions taken as prophecy, their abilities interpreted as divine blessing. Both types were equally dangerous. For the warp does not grant power without cost, and Psykers without guidance are candles burning at both ends, bright for a moment then consumed by the very flame that empowers them. Across the galaxy, similar stories unfolded with infinite variation. On a snowbound world, a woman wielding a functioning Las rifle became queen of 1,000 tribes that had warred for generations. On a volcanic moon, a technocrat discovered a forgotten missile silo and used it to extort neighboring settlements into submission. On a lush forest world, a warlord forged an empire by taming ancient terraforming engines, using them to reshape entire landscapes to isolate his enemies. On a shattered station, orbiting a dead star, a cult declared that the warp storms were the breath of gods, and that only they could interpret the divine will. Humanity, once unified by travel and trade, fractured into nations, baronies, tribes, fiefdoms, empires, and cult states that knew nothing of each other beyond fading myths. With no central authority, warfare shifted from the exception to the expectation. Territory meant survival. Resources meant power. Weapons meant life. Every world became a closed system where any shortage, fuel, medicine, water, food, was a spark that could ignite planet-wide conflict. And the warp, ever watchful, ever hungry, twisted and magnified every act of violence, until the storms above seemed to pulse in time with the heartbeat of human suffering. The rise of warlords did not happen because humanity was cruel. It happened because humanity was afraid. And in fear, people seek protection, structure, leadership, even if that leadership is harsh, unjust, or tyrannical. Better a cruel ruler than no ruler. Better a harsh order than the anarchy that lurked in every shadow of the Age of Strife. The Tyrants rose because the galaxy no longer offered alternatives. The empires formed because the void between stars offered no comfort. The warlords ruled because they had to, because their worlds were dying, because no help was coming, because isolation crowned whomever could hold power long enough to forge a kingdom from it. And so across the breadth of human space, civilization compacted like lungs exhaling for the last time. Each world became its own destiny, each culture its own experiment, each tyrant its own sovereign star. The galaxy was no longer a web of unity, but a mosaic of fragments, each shaped by desperation and time. And through it all, the warp storms raged, their fury soft only when viewed from afar, their whispers growing louder in every dreaming mind. Humanity, alone, divided and struggling to survive, was now ripe for horrors far greater than mere warlords. Chaos was watching, chaos was listening, chaos was waiting. For the Age of Strife was far from over, and the darkest chapters were still to come. Isolation changed humanity. Not only in culture, not only in language, not only in memory, but in the body, in the mind, in the soul. For the warp was no longer a distant, abstract realm used for navigation and communication. It was awake, alive, listening, And as human emotion fed the storms that churned within it, something began to shift in the very essence of mankind. Mutations did not begin with monstrous forms or grotesque deformities. They began subtly, softly, like the shifting of a breeze that no one notices until the forest begins to bend. Even before the Psyker academies fell, humans had begun to show slight abnormalities. Children born with unusual sensitivity to emotions, infants who cried when warp storms intensified as though hearing a voice no one else could, teens who dreamed in colors that had no name in any human tongue. Some could predict events minutes before they happened. Others sensed danger like an instinct sharpened beyond nature's capability. Small changes, barely noticeable, easy to dismiss, but nothing born during the Age of Strife was truly small. The warp storms did not simply disrupt travel, they infused life with new, unpredictable currents. And those currents left fingerprints on every generation. Humanity had once been unified in physical form, a single species spread across the stars. Isolation ended that. On each world, behind the curtain of constant warp turbulence, humanity began to evolve in different directions. On high-gravity planets, children were born with compact frames and reinforced bone structures, their muscles dense and efficient. On irradiated wastelands, mutations granted resistance to toxins and radiation, even if the cost was shortened lifespan or strange physical traits. On shadowed worlds where the sun rarely rose through storm-choked skies, eyes grew larger, more reflective, capable of seeing in near-total darkness. On ocean planets, populations developed expanded lung capacity and heightened balance, their bodies adapting to ceaseless wave-torn habitats. Some of these changes were natural, born of environment and necessity. Others were not. Humanity by nature carries psychic resonance. In calm eras, that resonance is subtle, a whisper beneath consciousness rarely manifesting outside trained psychers. But the Age of Strife was not calm. And when billions cried out in fear, grief, anger, and desperation, the warp answered. It bled into flesh, into bone, into generations yet unborn. Children came into the world with eyes that glowed faintly in moments of stress. Infants exuded an emotional pressure that calmed or agitated those around them. Some toddlers could move objects without touching them. Others heard whispers in their sleep, whispers that seemed to respond when spoken to. Not all mutations were harmless. Some were catastrophic. Some were born from minds that burned too brightly or too violently to survive the strain of existence. On certain planets, there were infants who died within minutes of being born, their souls consumed by sudden warp flare as their emerging presence opened cracks that nothing mortal could close. On others, toddlers unintentionally released bursts of psychic force that could shatter glass, stop hearts, or ignite fire. One world recorded the birth of an entire generation of whisper-touched children, every one of them born with a faint halo of shimmering distortion around their skulls. The halo faded with age. The psychic instability did not. Human societies have never responded calmly to the unknown. On some worlds, mutants and Psyker-touched children were embraced, trained, protected, integrated into leadership. These places managed their changes with wisdom and caution. Most worlds were not so fortunate. Fear, amplified by isolation and uncertainty, hardened into law. Monitor the children. Isolate the unstable. Purge the dangerous. Entire villages created rituals to identify warp-touched infants. Some communities developed superstitions, differentiating between blessed marks and cursed signs. Others took harsher measures. In the darkest corners of the Age of Strife, newborns who showed the slightest abnormal trait were hidden, banished, or quietly killed by terrified midwives who believed they were sparing the world from disaster. And in some places, these actions only intensified warp activity. For the warp responds to emotion, and fear is a powerful catalyst. Over centuries, some isolated worlds experienced mutation not as rare events, but as normal evolution. Their populations shifted generation after generation into forms no longer entirely baseline human. On a fog-wrapped moon, the people grew tall and thin, their limbs flexible, their skin pale as ash. adapted not for beauty but survival in perpetual twilight. On a world ravaged by psychic storms, the populace gained natural resistance to warp echoes, though many carried strange patterns of iridescence beneath their skin. On a scorching desert world, humans developed heat-dispersing organs and thickened skin that shifted color in response to temperature. None of these people believed themselves to be less human, nor were they. Humanity's definition had simply become more fluid. Yet there were worlds where the warp's influence grew too deep. Worlds where mutation was not gentle adaptation but uncontrolled corruption. On these planets, bodies twisted into impossible forms. Limbs grew in strange directions. Bodies expanded or shrank in grotesque disproportions. Organs manifested outside the flesh. Mouths opened where no mouths belonged. These were not evolutions, they were curses. Raw warp imprinting directly onto biology. Some of these creatures retained their minds. Others lost them entirely. Worlds afflicted by such horrors often tore themselves apart in civil wars as humans fought humans who no longer looked human at all. As warp storms intensified, the four great powers within the Immaterium, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, felt greater and greater pull from humanity's turmoil. They did not appear directly, not yet, but their influence filtered through the cracks. On war-torn worlds, and newborns emerged with heightened aggression, their tempers sharp as blades. On worlds steeped in despair, mutation slowed decay, preserved life even as bodies failed, twisting survival into something grotesque. On worlds filled with anxiety and desperate hope, children were born with uncanny foresight, minds shaped by possibility and change. On worlds of indulgence and excess, mutations heightened senses to unbearable degrees, making pleasure a consuming fire and pain an intoxicating echo. Most people never spoke the gods' names. Most did not even know them. But the warp knows its own children long before they know themselves. The worst tragedies of the Age of Strife were not the battles between planets, but the wars waged within them. Neighbors suspected each other of corruption. Families turned on their own blood if a child's eyes glowed or a voice echoed with psychic resonance. Entire settlements collapsed when a single Psyker lost control and released a deadly surge of warp energy. And everywhere, the more humanity feared mutation, the more the warp fed on that fear, growing stronger in response. A cycle that deepened with every generation. By the height of the Age of Strife, there were worlds where humanity had split into distinct castes defined by mutation. Those who looked unchanged. Those who looked strange but remained human. Those who looked monstrous but held human minds. And those who had become something else entirely, twisted beyond recognition by the lingering nightmares of the warp. These worlds often became battlefields without end, locked in civil wars driven not by politics or resources, but by fear of the other. And every scream, every grief, every drop of blood spilled fed into the storms above until the sky itself seemed to pulse with pain. Not all mutation was monstrous. Not all change was harmful. Some evolutions would later prove essential to humanity's survival in the Imperium's darkest hours. Some would give rise to unique cultures that endured long after the Age of Strife ended. Some would produce heroes and legions whose genetic quirks shaped the destiny of entire sectors. The Age of Strife did not simply wound humanity. It reshaped it, expanded it, forced evolution under pressure no species should ever endure. Humanity survived not because it was strong, but because it could change, because it had to change, because the warp left it no choice. By the time the Age of Strife had reached its midpoint, the humanity that existed across the stars was no longer the humanity that had built the Golden Age. It was fractured, mutated, diverse, warp-touched, emotionally scarred. 1,000 subspecies of human existed where once there had been one. And as the warp storms roared in the heavens, and as mutation tore and reshaped entire populations, the galaxy prepared itself for a new chapter. One darker, stranger, and far more violent than anything that had come before. For demons were beginning to step closer, and soon the boundary between reality and nightmare would thin beyond anything humanity had ever imagined. For countless generations, humanity had feared the warp as an ocean of thought, a realm of dreams and emotion that lay parallel to reality. Dangerous, unpredictable, but distant. A place that could twist a mind but rarely touch the body. A place that whispered but did not walk. A place of shadows seen only by psychers and felt only by navigators when the storms grew too wild. But as the Age of Strife deepened and warp turbulence rose like a great unending tide, the boundary between worlds stretched thin, and in many places too many that boundary tore. What slipped through was not always seen, not always heard, not always understood, but it was felt, deeply, instinctively, primally. For demons, true demons, had begun to step into reality, and humanity, broken and isolated, was unprepared for what watched them from the other side. The earliest warp ruptures did not look like portals ripped dramatically into the fabric of space. They began as whispers, as flickers in the corner of the eye, as cold, sudden breezes in sealed rooms. A farmer on an agri-world might pause mid-harvest to look behind him, feeling breath on the back of his neck despite standing alone in an empty field. A child might wake crying from a dream in which someone had been standing beside their bed, someone tall, thin, and eyeless. A miner might descend into a shaft and swear the darkness beat like a pulse. These moments could be dismissed, explained away, ignored, until they could not. A warp tear is not always visible. Sometimes it is a feeling, a distortion, a wrongness in the air itself. But on certain worlds, the cracks grew larger, large enough that the air began to shimmer like heated glass, large enough that sound warped strangely around them, echoing backwards or whispering in unfamiliar tones, large enough that shadows no longer obeyed their owners. There are records from a frontier settlement on a distant moon where a crack opened above the village square like a drifting scar. The people gathered beneath it, terrified yet drawn to the unnatural light that pulsed within. Some claimed they heard singing. Others claimed they heard screaming. Some said it was both, a sound woven of ecstasy and agony that shifted with each heartbeat. And then the tear widened. From it came shapes, not fully formed, not stable, but reaching. Hands made of smoke, faces collapsing and reforming, eyes that flickered like dying stars. The village burned. No survivors remained, only scorched stone and melted earth where houses once stood. Demons are not creatures in any traditional sense. They have no fixed shape, no true form, no stable anatomy. They are emotion given substance, instinct given movement, nightmares given purpose. And when they emerge into the material world, they often appear as reflections of the minds around them. On a war-torn world, a demon might manifest as a towering figure of blood and iron carved from anger and violence. On a world filled with despair, a demon might appear as a bloated mass of rot and sickness that laughs even as its flesh decays. On a planet of scheming tyrants, a demon might wear 1,000 shifting faces and speak in 1,000 shifting voices. And in places of excess and indulgence, demons might manifest as forms too beautiful to look upon without trembling, or too horrifying to comprehend without breaking. They were not invaders. They were reflections, mirrors of human suffering. In the early centuries of the Age of Strife, possession had been rare, a terrifying anomaly reserved for the most sensitive psychers. But as the storms intensified, the number of possessions rose sharply. Some were brief, passing shadows that flickered across a person's eyes before vanishing. Others were violent, moments where voices spoke through unwilling throats or limbs moved against the owner's will. The worst were permanent. Entire communities collapsed when a single psyker became a gateway for something hungry. A teacher on a quiet settlement might suddenly begin speaking in a language no human had ever known. A healer might begin inflicting wounds instead of treating them. A priest might turn their congregation into a frenzied mob with a single sermon spoken in a voice that echoed unnaturally through stone halls. And always afterwards the host was left hollow, drained, shaken, irreparably damaged. Some survived in broken minds. Some did not survive at all. Some became vessels for something still watching from behind their eyes. Not all planets suffered small incursions. Some were swallowed entirely. There are countless records from the darkest tomes of the Imperium of Worlds that simply ceased to exist as humanity knew them. On one ocean world, the sea itself turned a deep, unnatural red as something vast and unseen rose beneath the waves. Every ship that sailed out vanished. Every diver returned screaming or did not return at all. Eventually, the entire population fled inland, but the inland did not save them. On a shrine moon, a warp rift opened in the sky and rained motes of shimmering light that fell like ash. Those who touched it floated upward with serene smiles before dissolving into golden dust. Those who fled grew tentacles where their fingers had been. Some grew wings. Some grew eyes along their arms and ribs that blinked independently. The moon was declared lost, even before the storm finally swallowed it whole. On a jungle world, an entire continent became a maze of shifting paths that led nowhere but deeper into madness. Travelers stepped into the trees and emerged in places that should not exist, on mountaintops and caves under the surface of still lakes. Some walked forever and never emerged. The world was eventually abandoned to the warp that had claimed it. Even as warp travel had become dangerous beyond reason, astropathic communication, the soul-born messages sent through psychic relay, remained humanity's last tenuous connection. But demonic incursions did not merely affect planets. They affected thoughts, minds, souls. Astropaths began to hear whispers and transmissions. Some messages arrived twisted into cruel, laughing mockeries of the originals. Some astropaths received visions so intense that they clawed at their own faces to make them stop. Some burst into flame the moment they attempted to speak incoming messages aloud. And some transmissions were not human at all. They were bait, traps, lures sent by entities that had learned to mimic the rhythm of astropathic song. Soon the networks fell silent, not because no one transmitted, but because receiving had become far more deadly than ignorance. As the Age of Strife reached its darkest centuries, full demonic invasions became a grim reality. These were not armies in the traditional sense. No formations, no logistics, no commanders in mortal form. They were tides, waves of unreality swarming across cities and continents like living storms. Buildings melted into fleshy organic shapes. Streets twisted into spirals that led nowhere. Skies bled. Stars wept. Time looped and stuttered like a broken machine. Some demons took physical shape and stalked the land as beasts of nightmare, horned, fanged, clawed, impossible. Others remained formless, haunting the air as distortions that drove mortals mad with a touch. And everywhere they manifested, the warp screamed in victory. Some planetary civilizations fought back valiantly against the demonic tide. Some held out for years. Some even won battles, but no world caught in a full warp breach survived intact. Some fell in a single night. Some fell over generations. Slow, inevitable decline as reality grew thin and demons became permanent residents of their existence. Some fell in silence with no record of their final moments but the melted skeletons of once great cities and the faint hum of warp resonance still echoing through their ruins. And every time a world fell, the warp grew stronger. The storms intensified. The gods laughed louder. Humanity was feeding its own doom without ever knowing it. By the height of the Age of Strife, demons walking in reality was no longer rare. It was expected. Entire planets lived in the shadow of constant warp pressure. Some cultures adopted fatalistic acceptance, treating demonic appearances as natural disasters like storms or earthquakes. Others developed rituals to ward them away. Effective or not, belief was all they had. Many fell into madness, worship, or despair. And through it all, the warp storms continued to churn, shaped by fear, by mutation, by suffering, and by the blood spilled across 1,000,000 fractured worlds. Humanity, once a race of explorers, was now a race of survivors cowering beneath a haunted sky. Yet somewhere on Terra a presence stirred, a mind older than empire, a will stronger than chaos, watching, waiting, preparing. For the age of nightmares was nearing its end, and a new age was about to begin. Terra, The world where humanity began, the jewel once crowned with towers of crystal and steel, the center of knowledge, unity, and ambition, fell harder than almost any other world during the Age of Strife. For the collapse of human civilization did not merely reach Terra. It consumed it. Warp storms blotted out the sky. Astropathic networks went silent. Trade vanished. Governments imploded. And soon old Earth became a graveyard of its former glory. A cauldron where desperation, tribalism, and violence boiled endlessly for centuries upon centuries. It was here, in the birthplace of mankind, that humanity fell furthest. And here, in this broken cradle, that it would eventually rise again. Even as the wider human federation crumbled into isolation, Terra fought with fierce determination to maintain its authority. Administrators issued decree after decree, promising stability, order, and the eventual return of galactic unity. But decrees cannot stop storms. Laws cannot feed cities cut off from supply chains. Promises cannot calm a population watching its world sink deeper into chaos. The first upheavals were political, rival factions splitting the remnants of global governance, then civil unrest, riots, looting, military crackdowns that spilled more blood than they preserved peace. Finally, the great capitals fell silent. The halls of leadership emptied. The last bureaucrats and ministers either fled or were consumed by the spreading unrest. Terra no longer had nations, no longer had leaders. It had tribes, clans, gangs, warlords, and a world of ruins in which they fought. Terra had once been a gleaming world of intricate infrastructure. Orbital elevators, continent-spanning megacities, underground mag-rail networks, solar arrays stretching across deserts like metallic seas. When the Age of Strife arrived, these wonders became scars. Elevators fell from orbit, crashing with unimaginable force. Towers collapsed into rubble, burying entire districts. Subterranean tunnels flooded or filled with toxic gases. Power grids overloaded, ignited, and went dark. City after city sank into ruin, buildings crumbling like ancient tombs being reclaimed by time. Billions died in those first catastrophic decades. Those who survived emerged into a world barely recognizable. A world where the achievements of millennia lay buried beneath dust, ash, and vines that crept through shattered stone. Out of the ashes arose the tribes. Not primitive tribes in the ancient sense, but techno-barbarians. Warriors who grasped at the remnants of a dead age to forge weapons far beyond their limited understanding. These tribes varied wildly. Some were vast, ruling from fortified citadels built atop the ruins of once mighty cities. Some were nomadic, riding armored vehicles across deserts made from pulverized megastructures. Some were religious, worshipping the relics of humanity's past. Data slates, broken reactors, hollow idols, as sacred artifacts of long-lost gods. Some were brutal, enslaving other tribes and waging endless war over water, food, fuel, scrap metal, or simply pride. Others were strangely noble, upholding codes of honor and preserving knowledge in hidden vaults protected by oaths and sacrifice. But all of them shared one truth. Terra had become a world where survival required strength. Strength of body, strength of arms, strength of will. Thousands of years of destruction reshaped Terra's surface. There were places where cities had been bombarded so relentlessly that their stones had fused into mountains, black glassy ridges that cut the sky like jagged teeth. In other regions, the skeletons of collapsed hives rose like fossilized beasts, their frames twisted into bizarre shapes by fire and time. Between these ruins spread the ash wastes, vast plains of powdered concrete, shredded metal, and melted polymers where nothing grew except mutated brush and scavenger clans who fed on whatever they could salvage from the sands. The winds carried dust made from the pulverized bones of billions, and when night fell, those wastes echoed, with the distant rumble of engines, war cries, and the hum of malfunctioning machinery still clinging to life after 1,000 years. On Terra, psychic mutation was rampant, not in isolated incidents but in sweeping patterns across entire populations. Some children were born glowing faintly in their cradles. Others developed powers in adolescence, sometimes quietly, sometimes catastrophically. Many tribes feared the Psyker-born, seeing them as omens of demonic incursion or warp sickness. Some tribes executed such children immediately, believing it safer to spill innocent blood than risk corruption. Others enslaved them and used them as living weapons. A few rare tribes protected them, believing Psykers to be the last inheritance of humanity's ancient lineage. But with no training, no guidance, no shelter from the warp's fury, the Psyker-born rarely lived long. They burned out, lost control, opened cracks, summoned nightmares. Terra became both a graveyard and a crucible for psychic bloodlines, a place where evolution was tearing itself apart. As centuries passed, some tribes became kingdoms. Some warlords became tyrants. These were beings of immense cunning, ferocity, and ambition. Men and women who united dozens of rival clans under banners painted on cracked steel, tattooed on flesh, or burned into the hulls of ancient vehicles. They fought across continents for dominance. The Pan-Pacific Empire, a massive conglomeration of techno-barbarian clans that ruled from the ruined megacities of Asia's drowned coasts. The Indonesic bloc, dense island fortresses armed with salvaged orbital weapons that no one fully understood but which still fired with terrifying power. The Nord-American warlords, riders of enormous armored convoys that roamed the plains like mobile nations. The Afric bastions, city-states fortified with ancient energy shields, half functional, half myth, but still deadly. Each tyrant claimed dominion over their territory. None controlled all of Terra. War was constant. Borders shifted with every season, alliances formed and shattered in the span of days. Terra was a world ablaze, a furnace, where only the strongest could survive. Scattered across the planet were places no tribe dared enter. Dead zones where the air hummed with radiation and psychic residue. Craters left from ancient weapons powerful enough to rewrite landscapes. Collapsed vaults that glowed faintly with unfamiliar colors at night. And ruins where shapes moved in the dark that were not human and never had been. These were remnants of the ancient wars fought by humanity's ancestors. And reminders that even the greatest civilizations could leave behind ghosts in their wake. Some tribes spoke of these places in hushed tones, telling stories of machine spirits that devoured intruders or whispering voices that promised knowledge in exchange for obedience. But the truth was far simpler. These ruins were wounds on Terra's skin, trauma made manifest, and Terra had many traumas still to bleed. Life on Terra became a rhythm of conflict. Dawn brought raids, noon brought battles, night brought betrayal. Children were raised in the shadow of war. Elders died in its flames. Death was a neighbor, familiar, inevitable, unremarkable. And through it all, the warp storms above the planet swirled with renewed fury, responding to the violence below like a beast drawn to blood. The sky was a canvas of red lightning and violet fire. The ground was scarred with trenches, craters, and the rusted bones of ancient machines. If humanity had ever dreamed of peace, those dreams had long since faded. For somewhere in the wastes and ruins of old Earth, a presence watched. A being older than any tribe, older than any tyrant. A mind that had walked Terra when it was young. A mind that saw not only humanity's fall, but its potential to rise again. The Emperor was not yet a ruler, not yet a conqueror, not yet revealed. He was a whisper among warlords, a rumor in the camps of nomads, a shadow in the periphery of ancient battles. He watched, he learned, he waited. For the age of tribes was nearly spent, and Terra, though drowned in fire and stained in blood, was almost ready for its greatest and final unification. Before he was a lord of armies, before he commanded legions, before his golden banners swept across the stars, the Emperor walked in silence. Terra was broken, burning, divided, a world of ruin and ceaseless war. And yet, he did not appear with thunder or revelation. No beam of light split the clouds. No celestial host announced his coming. He walked among humanity as a wanderer, as a scholar, as a soldier, as a healer, as whatever the age required. For he had always been there, from the beginning, from humanity's first breath. Hidden in plain sight for tens of thousands of years, guiding subtly, nudging destiny gently so as not to break the fragile weave of mortal choice. But now, As Terra drowned beneath the ashes of its own violence, he stepped out of the shadows, not fully, not openly, but with purpose clearer than ever before. The Age of Tribes was ending. It needed to, and the Emperor was ready to begin his work. The Emperor's footsteps carried him across devastated continents, through ruined cities where skyscrapers had collapsed into stone canyons filled with dust, across deserts made of powdered concrete and melted metal, past forests mutated by radiation and twisted weather, where leaves glowed faintly in the dark, through tribes filled with fear, through tribes filled with rage, through tribes trying desperately to preserve a shred of dignity in the ruins of yesterday. He never revealed his true nature, but wherever he walked, change followed. Small changes at first, barely noticeable, ripples in a sea of blood. A violent chieftain would suddenly abandon a raid. A starving settlement would discover a hidden water source after a stranger's visit. A healer would find their trembling hands steady again. A dying elder would last one more night to pass on crucial knowledge. To most, he was simply a quiet figure with calm eyes and an aura that eased their fears. To a few, he was something more, a mystery that lingered long after he had gone. The Emperor spent decades among the shattered remnants of human learning. He walked the halls of ancient libraries buried beneath rubble. He restored crumbling data cores that would have been lost. He helped tribes recover fragments of old technology, weapons, tools, reactors, medical devices, and not enough to rebuild civilization, not yet, but enough to plant seeds. Seeds of knowledge, seeds of discipline, seeds of hope. He taught children their first letters in forgotten shelters lit by flickering lamps. He taught elders the principles of medicine, agriculture, and sanitation that had been lost in the centuries of violence. He taught warriors how to wield their weapons with discipline rather than cruelty. He taught leaders the value of strategy over brutality, and he taught them all that humanity could be more than what it had become. Though he desired peace, the Emperor was no stranger to battle. He fought when he must, quickly, efficiently, with mastery that no mortal warrior could match. He walked alone into Tyrants' camps and emerged without a scratch while their banners lay burning behind him. He ended wars not through slaughter but through precision, striking a single blow that toppled entire power structures without harming the innocent. Entire armies abandoned campaigns after encountering a stranger whose conviction shook their resolve. Legends spread of a golden-eyed wanderer who could not be killed, who moved like a shadow, who spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had seen, far beyond the horizon of mortal years. But no tribe claimed him, no priest named him, no warlord could control him. He remained elusive, enigmatic, a myth woven through whispers. Perhaps his greatest work in the shadows was with those whom humanity feared most, the Psyker-born, children trembling beneath the weight of power they could not control. To others they were cursed, dangerous, doomed. To the Emperor they were priceless, and he sought them out, protected them, calmed their storms with the touch of his mind. He taught them breathing techniques, meditation, discipline, control. Lessons that would one day become the foundation of the Imperial Scholastica Psychana, the vast training order that would prevent the deaths of millions in the centuries to come. Many of these children survived only because he found them before terror or ignorance could claim their lives. And some, those who displayed rare fortitude, would go on to serve him directly, in small, quiet ways before the greater age that was fast approaching. The Emperor did not seek to save every tribe or every life. Harsh as it seemed, he allowed certain tyrants to rise and fall. He watched as tribes warred, as alliances broke, as leaders died from their own brutality. He intervened only when the consequences would threaten his long-term design, for Terra needed to be tempered like steel, heated, folded, struck, refined. The Age of Strife had broken humanity, but breaking is not always the end. It can also be the beginning of reshaping. Throughout his travels, the Emperor collected data, records of surviving technologies, maps of old infrastructure, notes on tribes and their customs, catalogs of surviving bloodlines, and details about Psyker emergence across Terra. This was not idle curiosity. It was preparation. Preparation for a unification so sweeping, so transformative, that the fractured tribes of Earth would one day speak of it as though it were myth, for he knew that Terra could not remain divided, not if humanity was ever to stand against the warp and the demons that now walked the stars. By the time the Emperor had spent more than a century walking the ruins, whispers of him had spread across continents. Some called him the Golden Man, some the Silent King, some the Wanderer in White, some the Teacher of Ghosts. Stories differed, but all agreed on one thing. Where he walked, the world shifted. A tyrant who sought dominion over half a continent was found dead without a single wound on his body. A tribe, known for brutality, suddenly renounced its campaigns and became protectors of refugees. A fortress city, on the verge of collapse, found its reactors restored, and its food stores replenished after a stranger spent one night within its walls. The myths grew beyond truth, but truth always lay at their heart. By the time the Emperor's wandering spanned centuries, Terra had reached a crucial threshold. The tribes were powerful but unstable, their wars devastating but unsustainable, their ambitions grand but chaotic. Old Earth was ready, not for peace but for leadership. Leadership strong enough to end the cycle of ruin. Leadership that could unite a fractured world under a single will. Leadership that could silence the endless battles and restore the possibility of civilization. And so, in the deepest century of the Age of Strife, the Emperor laid aside the last of his anonymity. He had watched, he had measured, he had learned, he had prepared. Now, he was ready to act. The unification wars were about to begin. When the Emperor finally chose to step from myth into motion, he did not declare himself with spectacle or divine revelation. No trumpets, no miracles, no armies of light descending from the heavens. Instead, he began with a single decision, a calm, deliberate step onto the stage of a world drowning in its own ruin. This moment, so small at first glance, so quiet, so unassuming, would ripple outward until it reshaped not only Terra, but every human world scattered across the galaxy. For unity begins not in thunder, but in intention. And the Emperor's intention was absolute. When the Emperor began his work in earnest, Terra was on the brink of annihilation. The great tyrants of the Pan-Pacific Empire were preparing for a campaign that would engulf half the planet. Warlords of Nordmerica clashed endlessly across irradiated plains, their armored convoys leaving trails of fire and scorched earth that smoldered for weeks. The Indonesic bloc threatened to unleash weapons of such destructive power that entire ocean basins might boil away into steam. Psyker outbreaks destabilized regions already on the edge of chaos. Famine crept across borders as supply networks collapsed further with every war. The sky flashed with storms of crimson lightning that crackled with warp residue. Terra was moments away from losing itself entirely. And yet, this was precisely the moment the Emperor had been waiting for. For only in absolute crisis could absolute change take root. The Emperor's first step was not conquest. Not yet, it was alliance. A calculated, almost surgical move to test the readiness of the tribes and the resilience of his own plan. In the highlands of Central Eurasia, he approached a small but disciplined tribe known among its neighbors as the 12 Spears. They were not the strongest, not the largest, not the richest, but they were stable, focused, respectful of knowledge. Led by a chieftain who valued cunning over brutality. The Emperor came to them not as a god, not as a king, but as a wanderer and master warrior whose presence changed the tone of every conversation. He offered guidance, he offered training, he offered strategy refined over millennia. And when their enemies descended from the mountains in a campaign meant to wipe them out, he fought beside them. The 12 Spears won a battle that should have destroyed them. Their chieftain knelt before the Emperor and swore loyalty with a solemn oath. "My tribe stands with you." It was a quiet moment, easily overlooked in the vast brutality of Terra's wars, but it marked the beginning of something irreversible. From that tiny foothold, the Emperor built carefully, not with haste, but with perfect timing. He transformed the 12 Spears from a modest tribe into a disciplined cadre of soldiers. He taught them the art of formation, of coordinated strikes, of precision over savagery. He reintroduced the principles of ancient warfare, tactics humanity had long forgotten. He repaired their weapons and armor with his own hands, reinforcing them with knowledge far beyond their understanding. Within months, they had become far more than a tribal militia. They were the seed of the Thunder Warriors, the proto-legions that would one day stand at the vanguard of the Emperor's conquest, not yet genetically enhanced, not yet superhuman, but disciplined, united, fearless, for they fought under a commander who radiated unshakable purpose. When the Emperor struck, he did so with terrifying precision. Not wide, not reckless, not loud. Each move was a lesson, each victory a demonstration of what unity could achieve. First, he targeted bandit clans that preyed on smaller settlements. Their defeat was swift, ruthless, final. Then he dismantled a tyrant lord's fortress whose walls had never been breached. The Emperor scaled them alone, in silence. Before opening the gates for his soldiers, the tyrant was defeated without a single drop of blood shed by the 12 spears. Next, he liberated a city-state whose people had been enslaved for generations. The liberated citizens did not flee, they joined him. His army grew, slowly, steadily, purposefully. By the end of that first year, he commanded not a tribe, but an emerging faction with vision, discipline, and unity unseen on Terra since the fall of the ancient federations. Though he rarely displayed them, the Emperor carried weapons unlike anything the tribes had ever seen. A blade that shimmered as though woven from sunlight, armor that gleamed like polished obsidian yet felt light as cloth, a presence that could halt armies with a single command. These were not relics of old Earth, nor were they artifacts of tribal craftsmanship. They were manifestations of knowledge so ancient, so advanced, that even the surviving scholars of Terra could not begin to comprehend them. To the tribes, the weapons seemed mystical, holy, divine. They were not divine, but they were enough to convince even the most stubborn warlords that the stranger who walked among them was more than a mere man. As his victories mounted, the Emperor's legend spread faster than his armies. Whispers turned to stories. Stories turned to myths. Myths turned to fear among the tyrants who ruled Terra's continents. Some warlords dismissed the tales as fantasy, until their territories fell within a week. Some believed he was a demon in human shape, until they met him and found only calm in his eyes. Some sought to ally with him. Only a handful were deemed worthy, and most were destroyed. Though he conquered lands, the Emperor's goal was never domination. It was preparation. Every settlement he liberated, he restored. Every tribe he unified, he taught. Every warrior he commanded, he disciplined. He rebuilt infrastructure where he could. He preserved knowledge whenever possible. He protected Psykers instead of killing them. He reintroduced law to lawless territories. Slowly, a shape emerged from the chaos, a vision of what Terra could become, stable, united, strong. For he knew that the Age of Strife was only the beginning of humanity's trials, and Terra must be forged into a weapon capable of surviving what came next. As more tribes pledged allegiance to the Emperor, as his armies grew stronger and more organized, the greatest tyrants of Terra began to take notice. The Pan-Pacific Empire declared him a threat. The Indonesian bloc issued proclamations demanding his execution. The Nord-American lords began preparing for a war unlike any they had ever fought. The Age of Tribes was ending. A new era was rising, one of steel, one of discipline, one of order, imposed by a will that could not be challenged. The Emperor had taken his first steps toward unity. Now the world would respond in kind. The unification wars were about to begin in earnest. And Terra, long broken, long forgotten, long drowned in blood and ruin, would soon feel the full weight of a godlike mind determined to rebuild it. The unification wars did not begin with a declaration, nor with diplomacy, nor with ceremony. They began with inevitability. The moment the Emperor chose to step into the open, to lead armies, to forge alliances, to crush tyranny with deliberate purpose, the world responded. War spread like wildfire across continents already soaked in centuries of conflict. But this war was different. It did not drift, chaotic and aimless like the battles that had plagued Terra for millennia. It moved with direction, with intent, with terrifying clarity. For the first time since the fall of ancient nations, the world saw an army that did not fight for survival, or plunder, or tribal pride, but for unity, for purpose, for a future that might be built from the ashes of a dying age. And at its head, calm as winter stars, walked the Emperor. The Thunder Warriors did not appear overnight. Their creation was slow, deliberate, and painstaking. But once complete, they were unlike anything Terra had ever seen. Massive, unyielding, engineered for war with genetic precision far beyond even the greatest minds of the Golden Age. Their hearts beat stronger. Their lungs drew breath that would choke any mortal. Their bones were reinforced like living ceramite. And their minds burned with singular purpose. They were not elegant like the future Adeptus Astartes. They were not refined, not graceful, not long-lived. They were weapons, living engines of conquest, designed for one task, to break Terra and remake it in the Emperor's image. When the Thunder Warriors joined the field, their presence reshaped the fate of every battle. The first major obstacle to the Emperor's advance was the Hesperian Brotherhood, a massive confederation of warrior clans who ruled the shattered remnants of Western Europe. They were brutal, heavily armed, and fiercely territorial. The Emperor approached them with terms of unity they refused violently. 3 days later, their capital lay in smoking ruins. The Thunder Warriors breached the walls in a single charge that shattered the Brotherhood's defenses like brittle bone. The Hesperian chieftains fought savagely, but their blades could not pierce the thick plates of Thunder Warrior armor. Their rockets could not crack the Emperor's formations. Their warlords fell one by one until the survivors knelt with trembling hands and offered allegiance to the Golden Wanderer who had toppled a nation in less than 1 week. Terra took notice. The world felt the tremor. A power unlike any before had ignited its first blaze. Though brute force was a tool, it was not the Emperor's philosophy. He did not conquer for pleasure. He did not revel in slaughter. He did not crush weak tribes merely to display his might. His doctrine was precise: eliminate cruelty, end fragmentation, show mercy to those who accept unity, show no mercy to those who harm the innocent or threaten stability. Every campaign he launched followed this principle. And so, in territories torn by tyranny, the Emperor became a savior. In kingdoms ruled by brutality, he became a destroyer. To the oppressed, he was deliverance. To the cruel, he was death. The Indonesic bloc was among the greatest foes the Emperor would ever face during the Unification Wars. Massive island fortresses protected by redirected magma flows and ancient weapons salvaged from lost federations stood like iron teeth across the oceans. Their rulers were technocrats, cold and calculating, with armies of augmetic soldiers and gene-spliced shock troops who moved with mechanical precision. They declared the Emperor a global threat and launched preemptive strikes against his rising realm. Missiles arced across the sea, cities burned, entire populations fled inland from the devastation. And still the Emperor did not retaliate, not immediately. He waited, measured, observed, until the moment their arrogance became their undoing. The Emperor's counteroffensive was not a war, it was a correction. Thunder Warriors stormed beach fortresses in coordinated amphibious assaults that overwhelmed defenses built to withstand conventional armies but utterly unprepared for God-forged soldiers. The Emperor himself dueled the bloc's supreme technocrat within a burning citadel whose reactor threatened to explode at any second. The technocrat died with disbelief in his eyes, seeing too late that the being he opposed was not merely a rival, but a force of historical inevitability. The bloc fell. Its surviving citizens were spared and absorbed into the Emperor's growing union. The oceans grew quiet. Terra felt another shift. If the Indonesic bloc was dangerous, the Pan-Pacific Empire was apocalyptic. An empire of genetically modified giants, ferocious warlords, and bioengineered beasts unleashed across vast territories spanning Asia's dust-choked remains. Their supreme ruler, known simply as the Pan-Pacific Tyrant, was said to be as large as a thunder warrior, as cunning as a fox, and as ruthless as starvation. He viewed the Emperor not with fear but with fascination, as a challenger worthy of annihilation. And so the bloodiest campaigns of the Unification Wars began. Burning fields, smoldering forests, thunder warriors locked in combat against monstrous super soldiers whose roars shook the ground. 30 days of unbroken fighting in trenches filled with ash where the sun never pierced the smoke. Warlords challenged the Emperor one after another, seeking to break his momentum through ritual combat. None returned. The duel between the Emperor and the Pan-Pacific Tyrant became legend. Two giants clashed in a broken arena made from the shattered skeletons of pre-strife factories. When it ended, the Tyrant fell to his knees, armor split, breath failing. He looked up with something like respect and whispered, "If you had not come, the world would have burned anyway." Then he died, and with his death, the largest empire on Terra crumbled. The Emperor bowed his head out of respect, then marched onward. For Terra's unification was not yet complete. Nordmerica was a wasteland of irradiated plains, roaming convoys and fortress caravans that moved like nomadic kingdoms. The warlords there were brutal, ferocious, and fiercely independent, more like beasts than rulers. Yet the Emperor offered them the same choice he had given all others: join or fall. Most fought, all lost. But unlike many tyrants across Terra, some Nord-American warlords recognized what he offered: stability, order, and purpose. These warlords became some of his most loyal allies in later campaigns, for even they saw wisdom in aligning with the one force on Terra that sought construction over destruction. By the height of the Unification Wars, the Emperor's domain spanned continents, not through fear, though fear played its part, but through legitimacy, through hope, through structure, through a vision of humanity reclaiming the stars one day. He built roads, armories, shelters, training academies, libraries, factories, hospitals. Not grand structures, not yet, but foundations. The roots of what would become the greatest empire in human history. His armies marched under banners not of gold, not of worship, but of unity. And the world began to believe. By the time the last tyrants fell, Terra was unrecognizable. What had been a world of ruins was now a world of reconstruction. What had been tribal battlegrounds were now organized territories under a single banner. What had been fear and fragmentation became order. Harsh, unyielding, but stable. The Emperor had done the impossible. He had taken the ashes of the Age of Strife and forged them into the first spark of a new era. A unified Terra. A reborn humanity. The wars of unification were far from over, but their outcome was now certain. The Emperor would rule Terra. Humanity would rise again, and the long night would finally begin to recede. When the final battles of the Unification Wars fell silent, Terra did not cheer. There were no parades, no songs, no celebrations echoing across city streets or deserts of powdered ruin. Humanity was too tired for that, too scarred, too changed. Instead, a hush settled across the world. A deep, collective breath that Terra had not taken in thousands of years. For the first time since the old night began, war was not everywhere. Death was not constant. Chaos did not reign in every shadow. Terra, after millennia of devastation, was unified. And the Emperor, silent, towering, eternal, stood at the center of the world. He had rebuilt from blood, fire, and purpose. Unity did not come all at once. Even after the great tyrants fell, pockets of resistance endured, small but stubborn. Some were tribes that refused to trust any banner but their own. Some were cults hiding in the ruins of old vaults, hoping their forgotten rituals would protect them from the inevitable. Some were warlords who still believed they could challenge a being who had conquered continents as easily as others breathe. These final resistances did not last long. The Emperor did not deploy armies against them, not anymore. He walked into their strongholds alone. Some laid down their weapons at the sight of him. Some fought, rage and desperation against inevitability. None prevailed. And when the last holdouts fell silent, the Emperor stood on the balcony of a half-ruined palace and looked out over the world that was finally his. The Thunder Warriors, who had served as the Emperor's hammer against the fractured tribes of old Earth, fought with unmatched ferocity to bring unity to its final phase. But as peace emerged, their fate became clear. They had been built for war, for the brutal, unrelenting violence of the Unification Wars. They were too unstable for peace. Their bodies burned too fiercely, their enhancements too volatile, their minds too scarred by the endless slaughter for which they had been born. The Emperor knew this from the beginning, and so, in the shadow of Terra's unification, he sent them into their last battles. Campaigns so dangerous that no normal warrior could have survived them. They faced the last mutant enclaves, the last techno-barbarian horrors, the last chemically augmented giants of the wastelands, and they triumphed. Every time. But one by one the Thunder Warriors fell, not from enemy blades but from their own design. Their bodies collapsed, their minds fractured, their purpose fulfilled. When the last Thunder Warrior breathed his final breath, Terra bowed its head. They had been monstrous. They had been brutal. They had been necessary. And now they were gone. In the place of the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor revealed his next creation, the Legions Astartes, and not brutish, not short-lived, not doomed, but refined, disciplined, engineered with elegance and purpose that far exceeded their predecessors. The first Space Marines emerged quietly from their gene forges, each carrying within them the seed of a future legion. They were not unleashed upon Terra. They were not needed for conquest. Their time was coming, but not here, not now, for Terra was already won. Unity is not merely the absence of war. It is structure, order, purpose. With the world conquered, the Emperor began the immense task of building a government that could sustain a civilization reborn from ruin. He called together scholars, engineers, leaders of surviving communities, and loyal chieftains from the unification campaigns. From them, he forged the earliest foundations of the Council of Terra, a governing body that would shape the Emperor's laws and manage the reconstruction of the planet. Not all agreed with him. Not all understood him. But none could deny his authority. They worked day after day in chambers once filled with dust and ruin, now filled with maps, plans, and new designs for a Terra that would rise from the ashes. The Emperor did not only build armies and governments, and he built a world. He restored water networks. Ancient aquifers and collapsed pipelines were reforged, bringing clean water to millions who had never known it. He revived power infrastructures, and old reactors were rekindled. Energy webs once thought beyond repair hummed to life again. He rebuilt cities, not as they once were, sprawling hives of decadence, but as fortified, efficient bastions of civilization. He reclaimed the wastes. Land once lost to radiation and pollution was purified through technologies only he understood. Where tribes once fought over scraps, new settlements arose, connected by highways cleared of debris and guarded by newly trained militias. The world slowly healed. As the Emperor brought order to the cradle of mankind, something remarkable occurred. Above Terra, the warp storms began to weaken. Not vanish, not yet, but weaken. The sky, once constantly aflame with unnatural lightning, grew calmer, more stable. Astropaths, those few still living, reported a faint softening in the Immaterium's roar. It was not coincidence, for the warp responds to thought, to emotion, to suffering. And Terra, united for the first time in millennia, no longer howled with the same chaos that had fed the storms. Humanity's home was stabilizing, healing, preparing. Peace on Terra did not mean the absence of hardship. There were still diseases to cure, cities to repair, Psykers to train, cultists to root out before their whispers corrupted new minds. But there was direction, purpose, leadership unbroken by the madness of the Age of Strife. Children grew up without the sound of gunfire echoing in their ears. Families slept under roofs instead of ruins. Communities looked toward tomorrow instead of fearing every sunrise. And for the first time in thousands of years, hope was no longer a myth. Terra was unified, rebuilt, ordered, stable. But the Emperor did not rest. He had seen the state of the galaxy. He knew the horrors that lurked beyond the thin veil of calm around Terra. He knew of humanity's scattered worlds, some thriving in isolation, others enslaved, corrupted, or lost to the warp's embrace. He knew that unification of Terra was not an end. It was the beginning, a foundation, a launch point. Humanity was fragmented across millions of stars, and the Emperor intended to gather them, to restore them, to protect them. From demons, from xenos, from themselves. The Great Crusade was no longer a distant dream. It was coming, soon, and Terra, reborn, unified, healed, was ready. Terra stood unified, its cities rebuilt, its tribes merged, its tyrants fallen, its skies calmer than they had been in thousands of years. But the Emperor did not celebrate. He did not linger in triumph. He did not pause to enjoy the peace he had carved with centuries of sacrifice. Instead, he looked upward, toward the void, toward the scattered, forgotten children of humanity lost among cold stars and roaring storms. The unification of Terra had been necessary, a foundation for something far greater. But the Emperor's purpose had never been limited to a single world. His canvas was the galaxy. His vision was the species entire. For the Age of Strife still raged beyond Terra's orbit. Warp storms still howled around isolated colonies. Demons still crawled through fractured realities. Human worlds still burned in darkness without guidance. The Emperor was watching, measuring, preparing. The Great Crusade was already written in his mind. Each star system a note in a vast cosmic symphony waiting to be brought into harmony again. High atop the ancient towers of rebuilt Terra, the Emperor spent nights in contemplative silence, gazing into the void. Others saw only blackness and points of distant fire. He saw everything. He saw the faint psychic flares of human minds living in fear on worlds cut off for millennia. He saw the flicker of Xenos empires gathering strength in the absence of human unity. He saw ancient predatory species waiting at the edges of darkness, aware of Terra's rebirth and wary of the power beneath it. He saw lost human cultures warped by strange environments, stranger histories, and sometimes the warp itself. He saw the broken fragments of the once great human federation, now isolated, mutated, or enslaved by hostile powers. And he saw opportunity to mend, to unify, to reclaim the destiny that humanity had nearly allowed to slip into oblivion. The Emperor possessed unmatched power, psychic, physical, strategic. But even he could not cross the galaxy alone. The Thunder Warriors were gone, honored, remembered, but too unstable to build a future. The human armies of Terra were brave, loyal, and newly disciplined, but they were mortal, fragile, limited against the horrors that lurked among distant stars. The Emperor needed warriors who could endure what mortals could not. Warriors who would be symbols as much as soldiers. Warriors who could rebuild entire civilizations, not simply claim them. Warriors who could stand beside him on a journey across a hostile galaxy. Warriors born not merely from gene forges but from purpose. And so he began his greatest work. In hidden vaults beneath the surface of Terra, sealed behind doors no mortal hand could ever hope to open, the Emperor forged 20 vessels of perfection, not copies of himself, not children in the mortal sense, but Primarchs, beings equal parts genetics, science, and metaphysical art. Each one was designed to embody a trait the Emperor deemed essential for rebuilding humanity on a galactic scale. Courage, wisdom, honor, resolve, compassion, ferocity, logic, leadership, ingenuity, adaptability. 20 facets of mankind's potential, given form, given breath, given destiny. Behind their gestation chambers, ancient sigils glowed with soft light. Machines hummed with songs older than Terra. Genetic sequences woven with psychic resonance fluttered like living scripts across floating hololithic screens. The Primarchs were not meant to be mere generals. They were meant to be the pillars of the coming age, the anchors around which entire legions would form, the keys that would open the galaxy to the Emperor's vision. But the warp is never silent, and as the Emperor worked, the Immaterium shuddered with awareness. The gods of chaos, ancient, hungry, always listening, felt the shaping of something new, something dangerous, something that would threaten their influence over humanity. And so they reached out, not with claws, not with fangs, but with distortion, with corruption, with the subtle twisting of time and space that only the warp can achieve. A storm formed, unnatural, immense, over Terra's skies, howling with psychic malice. It tore through the vaults where the Primarchs slept. It wrapped its metaphysical tendrils around their cradles. and in a single cataclysmic moment that the Primarchs vanished, the gestation chambers ruptured with brilliant light. Warp energies whirled like a hurricane. The 20 infant Primarchs were pulled into the immaterium, carried on impossible tides to worlds spread across the distant galaxy. Some landed on harsh worlds, some on noble ones, some among monsters, some among civilizations that would one day be allies. The Emperor felt each one tear away from him like a shard of his own soul ripped from his body. When the storm cleared, the vault was silent, the cradles empty, the chambers broken. The Emperor did not rage, did not despair, did not mourn. Instead, he placed his hand on the cold remains of the nearest cradle and whispered quietly, "I will find you." For the Primarchs were not lost forever. The galaxy had scattered them, but the galaxy was mortal, finite, reachable. He would walk from star to star until each one stood at his side again. The Emperor had planned for the Primarchs to lead the legions Astartes, the genetically enhanced warriors who would become the backbone of his Great Crusade. But the Primarchs were gone. So he adapted. He always adapted. Using the genetic templates he had crafted for his 20 lost sons, he created the first Space Marines. They were taller than any mortal man, stronger, harder, more disciplined, more loyal. Each legion born from the gene seed of a Primarch not yet found, waiting for their father to return and claim them. The Astartes were not as mighty as the Primarchs, nor as raw as the Thunder Warriors, but they were balanced, refined, perfected, ready for the galaxy. The Emperor did not launch his fleets immediately. He prepared, he planned, he wove infrastructure into the planet's bones. New shipyards rose from oceans, orbital stations were reconstructed from decayed satellites. Massive starfleets were built in the void above Terra. Factories began forging weapons the likes of which no human had seen since the Golden Age. Psyker academies were established to prevent the disasters that had plagued humanity for thousands of years. The Council of Terra expanded, forming the first mechanisms of imperial governance. And the people, after millennia of fear, looked upward with hope. On the eve of the Great Crusade, the Emperor stood alone on a balcony overlooking Terra's night sky. Below him, the world he had unified glowed with newly restored lights. Above him, the stars waited. He spoke to no one. Yet his thoughts echoed across the warp like distant thunder. Humanity will be whole again. The darkness will recede. My sons will return to me. The future begins now. He closed his eyes, listened to the hum of a world reborn. And when he opened them, the galaxy trembled, for he had chosen to take the next step. The sky above Terra burned with a new kind of fire, not the red glow of orbital bombardment, nor the sickly flicker of warp storms that had once hemmed the planet in isolation, but the clean, steady light of engines igniting for exploration, for reclamation, for destiny. After millennia trapped beneath the shroud of old night, humanity was ready to rise again. The Great Crusade had not yet begun in full force, but the first voyages, the first cautious steps into a wounded, darkened galaxy, were ready. The Emperor did not stand with fanfare or address billions, and he simply walked aboard his flagship, a vessel built from forgotten knowledge and newborn discipline. As he took his place within the command throne, the ship's core systems awakened in reverent silence. The galaxy was waiting. The moment the Emperor's flagship broke the upper atmosphere, Terra held its breath. People gathered on balconies, on rooftops, on city walls still patched with the scars of the unification wars. Children pointed toward the sky with wide eyes. Elders wept softly. For the first time in thousands of years, a human starship left Terra with a purpose greater than mere survival. It carried hope, ambition, destiny, and the Emperor carried memory, the memory of every world humanity had lost during the Age of Strife. The fleet ascended into the quiet dark with the solemn grace of a pilgrimage. When the engines dimmed and the ship drifted through the void, the Emperor sat in deliberate stillness. He was listening. Space is not silent for a mind like his. He heard the faint psychic cries of scared populations across distant stars. He heard the rumbling pressure of warp storms still raging around isolated systems. He heard the echoes of old civilizations, fragments and ghosts of the golden age of technology, now broken and scattered like bones across an endless ocean. What to others was emptiness was to him a vast, strained lattice of suffering, struggle, and flickering hope. And he knew the galaxy would not welcome him as Terra had. But he also knew that he did not come to be welcomed. He came to reclaim. The first world they approached was a fragment of humanity's former glory, a relay station drifting near the edge of the Sol system's reach. It had once served as a communication hub between Terra and the outer colonies. Now it was a tomb. The Emperor's ship locked onto the station with a gentle lurch. A team of his earliest Astartes, proto-marines still refining their craft, boarded it in near silence. Inside, they found no survivors, just frozen corridors, dim, flickering screens, and old messages still looping in fractured code, pleas for aid that had gone unheard for centuries. The Emperor walked these halls with bowed head, not in sorrow, in resolve, for this station was the first reminder that humanity had once touched the stars, and would again. Before venturing too far from Terra, the Emperor turned his attention to the nearest body that had once been humanity's partner in spaceflight. Luna, the moon scarred and cratered from thousands of years of misuse and old bombardments, still housed ancient vaults beneath its gray surface, relics of the Golden Age. Some contained technologies far beyond what Terra could rebuild alone. Some contained machines too dangerous for any human mind short of the Emperor's. Some contained records of the earliest voyages between the stars, star charts from a time before warp storms had torn the galaxy apart. The Emperor walked through these silent chambers as if returning to an old homeland. His presence alone activated dormant systems that hummed with faint golden light. Here he gathered the first tools that would make interstellar travel safe again. Here he pieced together the first fragments of the great puzzle of humanity's scattering. Here he found his direction. With the map from Luna's vaults anchored into the fleet's navigation systems, the Emperor set course for a world once marked as a thriving colony during the Golden Age. Fergast Prime. Warp travel was still dangerous. The storms had not fully subsided. Even the Emperor's presence could not eliminate the risk entirely. But the fleet slipped through the immaterium with care and discipline, guided by psychic insight that no mortal navigator could match. When they emerged, an ocean world unfolded before them like a sapphire jewel. But it was not as it had been. The seas were tempestuous, boiling with strange colors. Vast islands had been swallowed by rising tides over centuries without maintenance. And above the surface, stormlights flickered with warp-tainted intensity. Yet there were humans, alive, changed by generations of isolation, but unmistakably human. The Emperor landed in a small settlement built of coral stone and repurposed metal. The people knelt instinctively at the sight of him. But he raised his hand and spoke to them with the softness of calm seas. He did not demand worship. He did not speak of conquest. He asked them what they needed. They answered through tears, protection, connection, a place in something larger. He gave it, quietly, gently. And Fergast Prime became the first human world reclaimed since the Age of Strife began. The Emperor's approach to every world was deliberate, a pattern that would shape the entire Great Crusade. He observed first, always, silently. He sought to understand the culture, the conditions, the threats, and the remnants of old technologies. He never destroyed a world's identity. He refined it. He elevated it. He brought stability where there was chaos, knowledge where there was fear, and unity where there was fragmentation. And only then did he raise the flag of Terra upon its soil, not as a conqueror, though the galaxy would see him as such, but as a restorer of what humanity had once been. Each rediscovered world was a reminder of how deeply the Age of Strife had scarred humanity. Some societies lived in conditions more advanced than Terra. Some had regressed to near primitive cultures. Some had fallen under the sway of psychic terrors. And some had been enslaved by xenos who had watched the Golden Age collapse with predatory delight. Every journey the Emperor undertook reinforced his urgency. Terra's unity was only the first step. Humanity's soul had been scattered across the stars, and only the Emperor could gather it again. Between voyages, in moments of solitude within the ship's deep chambers, the Emperor stilled his mind and listened. Not with ears, with something deeper. Across the warp, faint impressions echoed back to him. A child surrounded by beasts, a young warrior on a world of ice, a scholar in a desert throne room of glass and bronze, a boy raised by priests on a world lit by eternal storms, a future king on a planet divided by brutal castes. 20 echoes, 20 suns, 20 destinies that would one day shape the galaxy. Each was distant, each was veiled, each was waiting. The Emperor did not fear the distance. He would find them, one by one. And when he did, the Great Crusade would truly begin. Just as the Emperor was preparing to chart a course toward another distant colony, a signal flickered through the void. Weak, warp-distorted, hardly more than a whisper, but unmistakably human. A distress call from a world long believed dead. The Emperor opened his eyes. The ship's bridge fell silent, waiting for his command. With one gesture, he directed the fleet toward that distant point of flickering light, toward the first real challenge, toward the first great confrontation, toward the first true test of humanity's resurgence. The first voyages had been peaceful, reverent, foundational, but now the galaxy would push back, and the Emperor would respond. The Emperor's fleet cut through the void toward the trembling signal, a whisper barely held together by fractured technology, warp static and desperate hope. The closer the fleet came, the clearer the message became, not in words, but in tone. Fear, submission, chains. This was no simple colony struggling to survive. This was a world calling out from beneath the weight of conquest. The galaxy, long left to its own devices, had not remained idle during humanity's collapse. Other species had grown bold, predatory, dominant, and now, as the Emperor approached his first true test beyond the light of Sol, he understood. Humanity was not merely scattered, it was enslaved, and he had come to liberate it. The distress beacon originated from a world once known as Carthenon, a jewel of the Golden Age. Lush valleys, towering cities, and oceans that shimmered like hammered silver. What the Emperor found was not the Carthenon recorded in ancient archives. It was a world scarred and trembling. Great mining pits tore through once living forests, bleeding fumes into the sky. Towering citadels of alien architecture loomed over broken cities, all sharp angles, unnatural alloys, and cold blue lights that pulsed like a heartbeat. Human settlements, clustered like refugee camps around the ruins, watched by alien machines that hovered like silent wardens. The Emperor stood at his ship's viewport as Carthenon filled the horizon. His expression did not harden, did not twist, did not flare with rage. He simply breathed in as if sensing the fear and subjugation below, and then he whispered softly, almost gently, "Begin descent." The aliens who ruled Carthenon were known in fragmented human myths as the K'Enar, though their true name was older than any human tongue. Pale, tall, with limbs jointed in too many places, they moved like drifting veils of bone-white silk. Their eyes were luminous slits that burned with predatory contempt. They had not come as invaders. They had come as opportunists, drawn to the vulnerable ruins of human civilization after the warp storms first ignited the Age of Strife. For thousands of years, they had harvested human worlds like crops. Carthenon was one of their most profitable holdings. The K'Enar had never encountered an enemy they could not starve, break, or terrify into submission. They did not yet understand what had just entered their skies. The Emperor landed in the ruins of Carthenon's capital, a city once home to 5 million souls, now reduced to barely 100,000 kept alive for labor. The people stared as he descended from his ship, golden armor gleaming but not blinding, his presence massive yet gentle. To them he was myth made flesh, a god stepping onto their soil. But he raised his hand and spoke softly. "I am not a god, I am your emperor, and I have come to free you." Whispers spread like fire through the broken streets. Hope, an emotion extinct on Carthenon for centuries, shuddered awake. The K'Enar took notice. A K'Enar patrol approached the Emperor within minutes of his arrival, tall figures moving with flowing grace. their armor a pale chitin grown like a second skin. Their leader extended a brittle limb and hissed in a voice like dry leaves, "This world is ours." The Emperor did not reply, not with words. He stepped forward with slow, deliberate calm. The Kennar raised their weapons, strange crystalline rods that hummed with lethal potential. The Emperor raised his hand. The weapons fell apart in silence, not shattered, unmade, reduced to motes of harmless dust. The patrol staggered back, alien eyes wide with something they had no word for: fear. The Kennar reacted swiftly. Within an hour, the sky filled with their warships, sleek crescents of bone-white metal descending like predatory birds. But the Emperor did not stand alone. He turned to the warriors arrayed behind him. The proto-marines, the earliest sons of the gene seed crafted from Primarchs he had not yet found. Their armor was plain, unadorned, not yet colored, in the heraldry of their future legions, but they radiated purpose, conviction, strength beyond any mortal soldier. The Emperor spoke softly. "Hold the city." The Astartes moved with silent precision. Lines formed, weapons lifted, breath steadied, and as the Kennar ships launched their first strike, scythes of energy falling like lightning, the Astartes raised their shields and held firm. The blasts struck their formation and bent like rain against an iron cliff. The Kennar had never seen such defiance. They would see much worse. The Emperor walked alone into the storm of falling fire. Every alien beam turned aside. Every blast dissolved before touching his armor. He raised his hand, barely, and the nearest Kennar ship began to glow from within. Its delicate structure convulsed as though crushed by invisible pressure. Then in utter silence, it imploded into a sphere of seamless metal that dropped into the sea below with a hiss. The other ships vanished behind clouds, retreating in panic. On the ground, the Kennar legions marched forward, thousands of pale bodies moving in unnatural unison. The Emperor stepped back and spoke to his Astartes. "Advance." What followed was not battle, it was inevitability. The Astartes moved like a tide into the alien lines, and their bolters roared, their blades shone, their strength broke the enemy ranks with terrifying ease. Where the Emperor brought patience, strategy, and quiet power, the Astartes brought the certainty of war. Hours passed, then silence. Alien bodies lay scattered across the cracked earth. Their machines smoldered in heaps of broken light. Their citadels, once towering symbols of subjugation, fell as the Emperor walked through them, each step undoing their unnatural structure like threads pulling from a tapestry. The humans of Carthanon emerged from hiding. Some approached on trembling legs, others fell to their knees, some wept openly. The Emperor did not command them to rise or to bow. He walked among them as one might walk among survivors of a long, cruel night, and he spoke to them with gentle certainty. "You are no longer alone. Terra remembers you. Humanity will stand as one again." Carthanon was the first world freed by the Emperor's hand, but it would not be the last. Far beyond Carthanon, in the cold reaches of their empire, the Kennar heard the news of their defeat. They had harvested human worlds for millennia. They had never known resistance that endured longer than a generation. But Terra had returned, and the being who led its armies was unlike anything they had recorded in all their centuries of predation. Their high caste convened in shadowed chambers of living bone and whispered in tones of alarm. The Emperor had not simply freed a world. He had awakened a memory they had long grown complacent ignoring. Humanity was rising again, and for the first time in their long, silent history, the Kennar felt something that shook them to their core. A threat. With Carthanon liberated, Terra's fleet resupplied and refitted, the Emperor stood once again before the star map. Countless worlds flickered with faint signals of human origin, some calling for help, some unaware of Terra's return, some silent and likely dead. He closed his eyes, reaching out across the warp for the next echo of suffering, of humanity, of destiny. A faint pulse responded. A world still alive, still fighting, still holding on to a sliver of hope. He opened his eyes and spoke one word: next. And with that, the Emperor and his burgeoning empire moved deeper into the vast dark sea of stars. The Emperor's fleet drifted through the void toward the faint pulse he had sensed. Not a cry for help this time. Not fear, not submission, but struggle. Persistence. A stubborn refusal to die. This signal had rhythm, steady, measured as though carried by engines older than memory. It led the fleet to a world locked in the shadow of a massive artificial moon. Its surface a labyrinth of iron plates, furnace vents, and colossal machine spires piercing the darkness. A place of industry, a place of discipline, a place where humanity had survived through precision and machinery instead of hope. The Emperor had arrived at Galatar, known in fragmented records as a major outpost during the Golden Age. But it had changed, profoundly. And the iron moon that circled it was the first sign that something remarkable lay hidden here. The artificial satellite was enormous, larger than any space station the Emperor had found so far, larger than any vessel humanity had built since the warp storms began. Its underside glowed faintly with blue-white lights, pulsing slowly like a sleeping giant breathing in its slumber. Ancient thruster arrays scarred its surface, silent but intact. And around it, hundreds of smaller stations drifted like metallic debris, some functional, some cracked open like broken eggshells, their contents long turned to dust. The iron moon was not abandoned, but it was wounded. The Emperor felt its tremors, faint vibrations echoing through the void like an immense machine struggling to maintain equilibrium after centuries of neglect. Its system still held power not through fortune, but through will. And beneath the layers of ancient metal he sensed something else. Human life, structured, disciplined, unyielding. The world below was just as changed. Gone were the forests and oceans recorded in the ancient maps. Now Galatar was a world of massive factories, sprawling metal plains and towering foundries whose chimneys pierced clouds of ash and steam. Entire continents had been mechanized. Massive conveyor belts moved raw materials across vast distances. Highways of reinforced steel stretched across valleys consumed by machinery. Cities were built vertically, stacked in layers like colossal furnaces reaching upward. And everywhere, beneath every steel walkway, behind every smokestack, inside every lit window, were humans. Not slaves, not refugees, not conquered. Workers, technicians, engineers, communities that had adapted to a world that required constant maintenance just to survive. They lived hard lives, but not hopeless ones. And that, in this dark galaxy, was rare. When the Emperor's ship descended into the main landing district of Galatar Prime, thousands gathered, not to kneel, but to observe. Men and women in soot-stained garments, foremen with metal augmetics on their arms and faces, children, with eyes wide from curiosity rather than fear. A man stepped forward, the high engineer marked by a chest plate bearing the crest of the iron moon. He bowed his head respectfully but did not kneel. "Stranger," he said, his voice deep and layered with mechanical amplification, "you approach a world that stands on its own." The Emperor's eyes softened just faintly. "I know," he replied. "That is why I come with open hand before closed fist." The high engineer tilted his head. A murmur passed through the crowd. This world had not seen a visitor from the stars in thousands of years, yet they stood with calm dignity, holding their ground as though they themselves guarded a secret, older than Terra's recent unification. In the days that followed, the Emperor learned the history of Galatar and its artificial moon. During the Golden Age, the Iron Moon had been a massive orbital factory, a hub for starship construction, terraformation engines, and interstellar logistics. During the Age of Strife, warp storms isolated Galatar from the rest of humanity. Left without support, the world turned inward. The Iron Moon became their lifeline, but its systems were too vast to run on automation alone. So the people of Galatar adapted. They repaired. They learned to maintain machinery beyond the understanding of any other isolated human society. They built a culture around precision, discipline, and ritual maintenance of ancient engines that no one alive had originally designed. For thousands of years, they kept the Iron Moon alive, and through it, themselves. It was humanity at its most resilient, most ingenious, most determined. A message carried across millennia. We endure. The Emperor visited the great training halls where young engineers were taught from childhood to wield tools older than their ancestors. He watched as children took apart and reassembled ancient devices with reverent precision. He observed the rite performed when a child completed their first machine core repair, a solemn ceremony, marked by silence, not celebration. And when he spoke to these young workers about Terra and the rebirth of human unity, their eyes lit with something he had not seen in decades: recognition. These children understood purpose, understood discipline, understood that humanity could be more than a collection of isolated worlds. The Emperor felt something stir deep within him, a faint but unmistakable echo, a resonance, a similarity, a shared thread of spirit. Someone like these children had been lost to him, one of his sons. Inside the Iron Moon's core, a labyrinth of ancient machinery, pulsing conduits and humming reactors. The Emperor paused. He laid his hand against a panel warmed by thousands of years of operation, and he felt it. A psychic imprint woven faintly into the moon's subatomic lattice. Not recent, thousands of years old, but unmistakable. One of his Primarchs had been here, not grown but scattered, hurtled across the galaxy by the warp as an infant, and deposited somewhere in this system. The Emperor's voice was barely a whisper. "My son." The High Engineer stepped forward, confused, but the Emperor said no more. The echo was too faint to identify yet, but it meant only one thing: he was close. Maybe not on Galatar itself, but somewhere nearby, somewhere reachable, somewhere alive. Despite the shared destiny he sensed, the Emperor did not demand Galatar's allegiance. He offered it, openly, respectfully. "Humanity rises again," he said before the assembled engineers. "Your world has endured through discipline and unity. Stand with me, and your strength will become the strength of all mankind." Silence. Then the High Engineer stepped forward. "We do not kneel," he said, "but we will stand with you, not submission." Alliance. The Emperor's fleet was resupplied with materials forged in the Iron Moon's ancient forges. The Astartes received new armor plates of exceptional quality. Terran scientists studied the moon's reactors with awe and reverence. Most importantly, the people of Galatar became one of the first true allies of Terra, not conquered but united in purpose. As the Emperor prepared to depart, he stood once more beneath the Iron Moon's glow. The faint psychic trace still lingered. A Primarch had passed this way, his destiny still yet unwritten but waiting. The Emperor stepped aboard his ship. The engines ignited. The fleet turned toward the region where the Primarch's echo felt strongest, toward a world that waited, unaware that its lost son was soon to be found, toward another step in humanity's great restoration. The faint psychic echo lingering in the Iron Moon pulled the Emperor's fleet toward a distant region of space, not a bright star cluster, not a bustling warp lane, but a quiet patch of dim starlight and sparse systems, a place most navigators would overlook entirely. Yet the Emperor moved with certainty, for he had felt the unmistakable imprint of a Primarch, a trace of will, a fragment of infant instinct frozen in the warp, a whisper of destiny echoing after thousands of silent years. Where lesser minds would have lost the trail, the Emperor followed it like a heartbeat in the dark. And as the fleet dropped from the warp, a single planet came into view. Green, mountainous, uneven, and crowned with the soft glow of a thin atmosphere. It was peaceful, even beautiful, in a galaxy rarely gentle. But within that peace lay immense strength, immense potential, immense legend. The Emperor had found the world of his first Primarch, a world about to awaken to its rightful place in human history. The people who lived there called it Syrex, a world steeped in ancient feudal cultures, proud kingdoms, and a code of honor older than any record. It was a world of towering citadels built of stone and metal left behind from ages unknown. A world of mountain fortresses spiraling upward into clouds that never ceased to cling lovingly to jagged peaks. A world of deep valleys where hearth fires glowed, in warm settlements surrounded by farmland. A world of warriors whose traditions were carved into the bones of the land. A world where leadership was earned, not inherited. And somewhere on this world, hidden among its people, shaped by its trials, lived one of the Emperor's sons. The old legends of XIII spoke of the day the sky split open in blue fire. A comet, the elders said, but not like any they had ever seen. It streaked not with flame, but with shimmering light that curved unnaturally as though guided by an invisible hand. Its arrival shook the earth, and in the crater that still smoked with faint warp heat, the villagers found a child, a newborn yet unburned, unharmed, calm amid the wreckage. They believed he was a gift from the heavens, a child sent to lead. They were not wrong. From the moment he could walk, the child showed a presence that commanded attention. His voice, even as a youth, held weight beyond his years. His mind drew connections from stories, tactics, and history with the ease of a seasoned scholar. His strength outpaced the mightiest warriors of the feudal clans, and his compassion, rare in a world that prized martial prowess, earned him deep loyalty. By the time he reached adulthood, the people of XIII had stopped calling him the Comet Child. They began calling him what he had earned, the Foundling King, not because he seized power, but because every clan, every chief, every warrior chose him, unanimously, without contest, without question. He united a world of warriors not through bloodshed, but through resonance, a shared understanding that he was meant to lead. And under his guidance, XIII entered an era of harmony unheard of in its long, violent history. The Emperor observed XIII for several days from orbit. He watched the armies of the Foundling King train with discipline rare among isolated worlds. He watched as the king negotiated disputes not with threats but with wisdom and calm authority. He watched as the people worked the land with respect, never taking more than needed. He watched as the world prospered, not through technology, not through fear, not through conquest, but through unity. It mirrored what the Emperor intended for humanity, and so he descended. The landing was quiet, ceremonial, peaceful. The Emperor stepped down onto XIII soil in a clearing overlooking the great mountain hall where the Foundling King held council. The king approached alone, tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that made even the Astartes straighten instinctively. His eyes met the Emperor's. Blue met gold. Recognition passed between them without words. A bond that had been severed by the warp was reforged in an instant, not through memory but through something deeper. A resonance of purpose, of identity, of destiny. The Foundling King fell to one knee, not in worship, not in submission, but in profound respect. "I have always waited for this moment," he said. The Emperor placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Rise, my son, your waiting is over." And with those words, the galaxy shifted. In the great hall, by the fire-lit hearths and carved stone pillars, the Foundling King told his father the name given to him by XIII tradition. Alaric, a name meaning resolute, steadfast, kingly. The Emperor spoke the name softly, as though acknowledging not only the man before him, but the destiny woven through his entire life. "Alaric," he repeated, "a fitting name for one who will lead legions." For though Alaric was not yet aware, his future was already carved in the Emperor's vision, and he did not resist. He felt drawn toward this purpose, as though every step of his life had prepared him for what was to come. When the Emperor addressed the people of XIII, he did so alongside Alaric. Their twin presences, one vast and ancient, one towering and noble, filled the grand courtyard with an aura of solemn destiny. The Emperor spoke of Terra, of humanity, of reunion. He spoke of a galaxy that needed restoration. He spoke of unity, of hope, of strength. And when he asked XIII to join him, there was no hesitation. Their Foundling King stood beside this stranger as though they had known each other for lifetimes. That was enough. The cheers echoed across the mountains of XIII for 3 days, not in worship, but in celebration of destiny fulfilled. On the day the Emperor revealed to Alaric his true nature, the Primarch listened in silence. He did not question his father's words. He did not doubt. He accepted, with calm, with dignity, with the unshakable resolve that had defined his entire life. "Then let me serve," he said simply. The Emperor nodded, for with Alaric found, the Great Crusade had taken its first true step forward, a step that would echo across the galaxy, a step toward reclaiming the other 19 sons, a step toward reshaping the fate of all humanity. With Alaric and the warriors of Cerex joining the Imperium, a new banner was added to humanity's rising empire. The Emperor stood aboard his flagship, looking out upon the star map. One Primarch found, 19 still lost, but the bond formed with Alaric sharpened his senses. The echoes of the others felt clearer now, closer, more certain. The next world was waiting, another history, another sun. The Emperor raised his hand, the fleet prepared for translation, and as the stars blurred into the swirling haze of the warp, the galaxy held its breath. For the father of 20 suns was coming. And so, for now, we let the Age of Strife fall quiet. The storms still rage in the far distance. The warp still shimmers beyond the veil. Lost worlds still turn in lonely orbits, and the Emperor and his scattered sons are still walking their long roads through history. But here, in this small corner of the tale, the voices soften. Terra has been reforged from ash and ruin. The first worlds have been reclaimed from darkness. The first Primarchs have stepped out of legend and into the Emperor's light. Far above, fleets glide between the stars, vast and patient, their engines a low, endless heartbeat in the night. Far below, on nameless worlds, children look up at unfamiliar skies and do not yet know that their destinies are entwined with empires, with gods, with a future still being written in fire and gold. All of it continues. All of it waits. The galaxy is vast, and there will be other wars, other worlds, other stories. But not tonight. Tonight the guns are silent, the banners are still. The marching feet have faded into the distance. You are adrift now on the quiet edge of this universe, held between distant starlight and the soft, slow turning of ancient worlds. Breathe in, and let the echoes of forgotten battles drift away. Breathe out and let the weight of empires and ages slip from your shoulders. Somewhere a golden figure stands at the window of a silent ship, watching over a sleeping species. His gaze is endless, his vigil unbroken. You do not have to watch, you do not have to fight, not now. You are safe at the very edge of the tale, where the light is dim, the hull is steady, and only the gentle hum of distant engines remains. Let the stars grow softer. Let the story grow quiet. Rest now, traveler of the far future. The galaxy will still be here when you wake.